Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The Erased Identity of the Dead. My name is Madison Clarke. I've been a nurse for over 8 years, working in the inpatient ward at Saint Elora Hospital, Pennsylvania. It's an old hospital, quietly tucked away in the outskirts of town, built in the 1930s. And no one really remembers why it was named after Saint Elora, a saint that doesn't appear in any official church records. That night, like every other, I started my shift at 11 p.m. November's cold bit sharply, and snow was drifting down outside the hallway windows. The pale white glow of the flickering neon lights reflected off the old tiled floors, casting a strange kind of light that, if you stood under it long enough, made time feel like it was slowing down. Near midnight, as I was making my usual rounds, I stopped outside room 204. The door was slightly ajar. The lights inside were off, but a dim glow from the hallway leaked in. Just enough for me to make out the faint silhouette of someone sitting on the hospital bed. I froze. Room 204 was supposed to be empty. I knew that for a fact. I had checked the patient list at the start of my shift. It had been unoccupied for nearly 3 weeks due to a broken heating system, which had only been fixed earlier that morning. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart thudding as a chill ran down my spine. The person, or whatever it was, sat motionless on the bed, head bowed slightly forward, arms limp at their sides. I stepped closer and turned on the light. There was no one there. The bed was still neatly made, the white sheets smooth and untouched. I was certain I'd seen someone there. I stepped back, quietly closed the door, and told myself it must have been a trick of the light, or maybe exhaustion. But just as I turned to walk away, I heard a sharp click behind me. The door creaked open again. I spun around. The room was empty. I decided to go down to the security office to check the hallway cameras. The security guard, Greg, was a friendly guy, though perpetually half asleep. When I told him what happened with room 204, he squinted at me, a look that was part skepticism, part fear. "You sure about that?" Greg asked, his voice suddenly low. I saw it with my own eyes. Someone sitting there, like a statue, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Greg slowly rewound the security footage. At the moment I passed by room 204, sure enough, a faint shape moved inside. A shadowy figure, like smoke, appeared near the doorway, and then vanished. "This isn't the first time," Greg muttered after a long, uneasy pause. I stared at him, waiting. Greg reached under the desk and pulled out an old dog-eared notebook. He flipped to a folded page. There was a photocopy of a patient file, but no name, only an ID number. 119A. This patient was admitted in 1974. The records went missing after a small fire broke out in the archives. The room you mentioned, that was where he spent his final days. A coldness washed over me. The air felt thick. Greg added, almost whispering, "Some nurses said they saw someone in room 204, but no one remembers the face. One even spoke to the patient for a while, until they realized there was no one assigned to that room on the shift log." I left the security office feeling dazed. I returned to the third floor. Room 204 stood silent, its door shut tight. I didn't plan on opening it again. Not that night. But when I got back to the nurse's station, something made my blood run cold. There was a medical file already opened on the desk. The top page clearly listed room 204 and the patient's name, Jonathan Reeds, a name that hadn't been on any list earlier. I picked it up. The paper was damp and smelled of mildew, like it had just been pulled from a basement. The photo showed a gaunt man with hollow eyes and pale corpse-like skin. Beneath it, a line scrawled in shaky red ink read, "I never left." I'm not telling this story to make anyone believe me, but that night was only the beginning of something much worse. In the following weeks, several patients began mentioning the man in the white hospital gown, watching them from the hallway windows. A medical intern went missing while checking emergency rooms, and the last person to see him said he was talking to a patient not listed in any record. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every time I passed room 204, I felt someone watching me from behind the cracked door. Maybe Jonathan Reeds never did leave, and maybe he's not alone. I never went back to room 204 after that night. At least I tried not to. But in a place like Saint Elora, the old, the damp, and the dead seem to seep into every brick of the walls. You can ignore a room, but you can't stop what lies behind its door from finding you. A week later, during the Friday night shift, Dr. Elizabeth Moore asked me to go down to the old records room in the basement to retrieve a copy of a 1974 inpatient file. There was an investigation into missing patient data from the 70s. I shivered the moment I heard that year. "You okay, Madison?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the look on my face. "I'm just cold," I lied. The truth was, the second she mentioned the basement, my stomach clenched like it was being twisted. The path to Saint Elora's old basement wasn't like anywhere else in the hospital. No signs, no motion lights. You had to know where you were going, and you had to bring a flashlight, because the light down there was never enough. It wasn't exactly dark, more like a murky dimness, like seeing through dirty water. I used my staff badge to unlock the rusted metal door leading down to the basement. The corridor below groaned with every metal echo as I stepped in. My footsteps multiplied by hundreds of unseen shadows. Dust-covered file shelves loomed on both sides, like they were bowing their heads to watch me pass. I found the cabinet marked A0119, the code for the old patient file. But when I pulled out the folder, something felt wrong. It wasn't just one file, but a thick bundle wrapped in red cloth tape, one end stained with dried blood. Someone had scrawled on the outside, "Not for new staff. Do not open unless you've heard the whole story." I opened it. Inside were blown-up photos of patients, but none of them had normal eyes. They all had pitch-black, pupilless eyes. Their faces looked like they'd just been pulled out of the dirt. Some photos were burned along the edges, still faintly smelling of smoke. Other pages were handwritten accounts of self-harm incidents occurring after patients came into contact with a man named Jonathan Reeds. At the bottom of each page, in deep red ink, a single phrase was repeated again and again. "Nothing here is a coincidence." I closed the file, but just then, my flashlight flickered. A soft footstep echoed at the far end of the dark hallway. I called out, "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a faint, dry chuckle echoed back, without hesitation. I grabbed the file and ran. But just as I reached the door, I froze. Someone had locked it from the outside. I pounded on the door, screamed, but no one heard me. The darkness behind me felt thick, pressing in. A faint scraping sound brushed past my ear, like someone running a finger down the back of my neck. I whipped around. No one there, but the file I was holding was gone. 20 minutes later, Greg, the night security guard, finally opened the door and pulled me out. His face went pale when he saw me curled in the corner, whispering over and over, "He never left. He never left." Greg brought me back to his office and made me a cup of coffee. After a few minutes, I managed to tell him everything. He sat in silence, then pulled a black and white photo from a drawer. It was a group picture of the nurses and doctors of Saint Elora from 1974. I recognized him instantly. The tall man in the hospital gown, standing in the center, the one I'd seen that first night in room 204. "That's Jonathan Reed's," Greg said. "But he wasn't a patient. He used to be a doctor." I felt my heart skip a beat. There were rumors he conducted secret experiments on psychiatric patients, locked them in unmarked rooms, injected them with unknown substances. One October night in 1974, the entire inpatient wing caught fire. 12 patients burned to death. All records were lost. Only one audio recording remained. Greg pulled out an old tape recorder. A man's distorted voice crackled through. "I'm still here. I see them walking, crying. I did what was necessary. They don't hurt anymore. They don't dream anymore. They are part of me. I am what's left of them." I shuddered. Greg stopped the tape. No one really knows what happened after the fire. But ever since, no one stays long in room 204. They go mad, run away, or vanish. I was about to leave when something slipped from the pocket of my lab coat. It was the file I had held in the basement. But now, it contained only a single sheet of paper. In shaky red ink, it read, "We don't dream, and neither should you." I started losing sleep. After the night, I got trapped in the basement and heard the recording of Jonathan Reed's voice. Something inside me shattered. I still went to work, still put on my nurse's uniform like always. But every time I walked past the third-floor hallway, where room 204 was, my heart clenched. It seemed I wasn't the only one who sensed something had changed. My co-workers started whispering about strange occurrences. A nurse named Carla, who had only been working here for 3 months, whispered to me one morning, "Have you ever seen a shadowy figure walking down the hallway around 3 a.m.? I said nothing. Carla swallowed hard, eyes darting behind my shoulder, as if expecting something to appear. It's happened 3 nights in a row. I was on duty on the 3rd floor when I saw a man in a hospital gown walk past the glass door. I ran after him, but the hallway was empty. Do you think maybe it's a ghost?" I wanted to say no, to brush it off, but the words got stuck in my throat, because I'd seen him too, not just once. I started dreaming, every night. Always the same nightmare. In the dream, I walked down the 3rd floor hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered. The hallway stretched on endlessly, and at the end was a door. Room 204. My hands trembled, but as if possessed, I kept walking. When I opened the door, the room inside was pitch black, and the stench of burnt flesh hit me like a wave. In the darkness, I saw him, Jonathan Reeds, sitting on the bed, holding his head, mumbling words I couldn't understand. Behind him, shadows slid along the walls, human-shaped but faceless. They writhed like they were trying to break free. I always woke up drenched in cold sweat. But the most terrifying part wasn't the dream. It was what I found the next morning. On my wrist were bruises, as if someone had gripped me tightly in my sleep. I could no longer tell what was dream and what was real. Then, on a Tuesday night, I decided to do the one thing no one had advised. I went back to room 204. That night's shift was quiet, with only a few patients. I asked for a short 15-minute break, grabbed a flashlight and a notebook to document whatever I saw. I told myself I was doing this to put an end to the nightmare. Or at least to understand why he kept coming to me. The door to room 204 creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air inside was thick with mold. It felt like time had stopped here since 1974. I shined the flashlight across the ceiling, the walls, and flinched when I saw long scratch marks like fingernails dragged from ceiling to floor. Someone had tried to claw their way out. I sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. And then I heard breathing right behind me. I turned around. No one, but when I pointed the flashlight at the floor, I saw something that froze my blood. A wet footprint, clear and defined, appearing step by step, coming toward me. I jumped to my feet, dropped the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, and then I saw him. Jonathan Reeds, standing by the edge of the bed, his face only inches from mine, eyes pitch black, no lips on his mouth, just a gaping void, stretched wide as if trying to devour me. I screamed, burst through the door, and ran straight to the nurse's station. Sweat drenched my back. My heart felt like it might burst. When Greg saw me, he only said one sentence. "You opened the door that was meant to stay locked forever." 2 days later, I was placed on temporary leave due to mental health concerns. But even at home, I found no peace. Every night, I started hearing ambulance sirens outside my window, even though my house was nearly 5 miles from the hospital. And the whispering, clear, constant, always the same words. "Come back, you're the final piece." Greg came to see me on a night of torrential rain. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken with dark circles. He spoke fast, voice trembling. "Something's happened. A nurse, Carlos, went missing last night. I was the last one to see her. She said she was going to check room 204. And then she vanished. No footage on the cameras, not in the logbook." A chill ran through me. Greg pulled a flash drive from his pocket. On it was a video from the 3rd floor hallway. In the footage, Carla is seen walking toward room 204. As she touches the doorknob, the video glitches violently. When the image stabilizes, she's gone. Only the door to room 204 remains, wide open, and someone is staring out from inside. We couldn't go to the police. Saint Elora had already been sued over a disappearance back in 1993, and the hospital board had enforced silence to protect its reputation. Greg whispered, "There's something in room 204. It's not just a ghost. It's smart. It remembers. And now, it chooses who stays." I gripped his hand tightly, looked deep into his eyes, and said something I never thought I'd hear myself say. "We have to go back before anyone else disappears." Story 2. Elevator to the underworld. I'm not sure what pulled me back to that building. Maybe it was foolish curiosity, or just the stubborn habit of a lonely man. It was an old structure on Elm Street, East Brooklyn. Once a psychiatric hospital shut down in the 1970s, later renovated into low-rent apartment units. I rented Unit 5C, a tiny studio with low ceilings and moldy peeling walls. But the thing that bothered me most wasn't the rats, nor the distant howling that sometimes echoed from the basement in the dead of night. It was the ancient elevator in the center of the building. This elevator wasn't like any I'd seen before. Every time I stepped inside, I felt like I wasn't standing in a normal metal box, but rather at the threshold of something deeper, more unsettling. At first, the control panel only showed buttons from B1 to floor 10. But then, one late night, after a long shift at the cafe near the subway station, I stepped in and froze. Below the B1 button, a new one had appeared. Faint, dirty, hand carved into the metal. B2. I had never seen it before. No one had ever mentioned a B2. According to the building's blueprints, which I had secretly peeked at out of curiosity, the lowest level was B1, where old mechanical systems and storage were housed. I meant to press floor 5, like always, but my finger moved on its own, trembling. It hovered, then pressed B2. The elevator gave a slight jolt. The lights flickered and it began to descend, but this time there was no sound, no humming gears, no steel cables groaning, just complete and utter silence. I can't fully explain what happened next. It didn't feel like I was moving. No sense of gravity, no vibration, only a weightless void. Then the doors opened. A wave of icy air hit me, like it came from hundreds of meters beneath the earth. I couldn't see anything beyond the elevator's threshold. The hallway ahead swallowed all light. I stepped out. The floor was cracked concrete. The walls, rusted metal, as if soaked in water for decades. The smell, a grotesque mix of mold, rotting meat and ozone. I walked the corridor, my phone's dim flashlight the only source of guidance. Somewhere behind me, I heard a metallic dragging sound. I spun around. Nothing. But when I aimed my light at a broken mirror on the left wall, I saw something that chilled me to my core. My reflection wasn't there. I'm not joking. This wasn't hallucination. The mirror reflected the hallway, the light, the stains, but not me. I began to feel cold, not physically, but deep inside, like something unseen was watching me, understanding my every move, my every thought. I ran back to the elevator, but the doors had shut, and the elevator was gone. I screamed, pounding on the wall where the doors had been. Only solid concrete remained, as if the elevator had never existed. Panic overtook me. I searched for a way out, but the hallway stretched on. No turns, no doors. Then I saw it. A rusted iron door, locked with an old-fashioned padlock. Nearby, I found a broken metal rod and used it to pry the lock open. After several agonizing minutes, the door creaked free. Inside was a room, a flickering neon light, and a man. A man in a hospital gown sitting in the corner with his back to me. I stepped closer and called out softly, "Hello? Sir, are you okay?" No answer. I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned around, his face pale, eyes sunken and black, as if he'd been dead for years. But his mouth moved, and in a dry, rasping whisper, he said, "They never let me leave. Now it's your turn." I stumbled back. The door behind me slammed shut. I pounded on it, screaming. Nothing. When I turned around again, he was gone. Only a large, spotless mirror remained. I stepped closer and realized I still couldn't see myself. But something else was there, behind me. Not him, not me. Something tall, vague, wrapped in twisted human-like skin. It didn't move. But when I turned to look, nothing. I looked back into the mirror. It was closer. I started to cry. I wanted to disappear. Then, a familiar sound. Ding! The elevator. I bolted from the room, chasing the faint yellow light down the corridor. And there it was. The elevator doors. I hit the button. They opened. I jumped in and slammed the button for floor 5 over and over. The elevator shook, then began to rise. But as it moved, I looked into the elevator mirror. Still nothing. No me. No one. Just a void. And behind me, it was back. I never saw myself in the mirror again. And I know now, I'm no longer me. I stepped out of the elevator just past 3 a.m. The entire building was silent, not a soul in sight. Only the faint buzz of fluorescent lights echoing down the hallway. I walked like a sleepwalker, my body trembling, heart racing with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I don't remember how I made it up to the 5th floor. The door to apartment 5C was still ajar, as if waiting for me to return. I closed it, locked it, but I couldn't sleep. I stood for hours in front of the bathroom mirror, scrutinizing every detail. There was no reflection. The light still lit the wall. My toothbrush was still there. My breath still fogged the glass. But I wasn't there. I didn't dare leave the apartment for the next 3 days. I survived on instant noodles and tap water. The TV stayed on 24/7, even though it played nothing but static. Whenever I glanced at a reflective surface, the bathroom mirror, the microwave door, even my phone screen when it was off, I never saw myself. Instead, sometimes I saw others. A little girl with a torn-up face staring from over my shoulder. An old man hanging from the ceiling behind me. A woman with long hair standing right at my back, mouth wide open in a silent scream. Each time I blinked, they vanished. But I knew they were real. I could feel their breath, smell the rot of decaying flesh, hear the whispers at night, never clear, but always enough to jolt me awake from nightmares, drenched in sweat. On the 4th day, I decided to leave the building. I needed to get far away from this cursed place. But when I stepped into the elevator, the B2 button was still there. I didn't touch it. I pressed floor 1. But the elevator didn't stop there. It descended on its own. This time I panicked. I slammed the control panel, tried hitting the emergency stop, pried at the doors. But nothing worked. The doors slid open. It wasn't the same old hallway anymore. It was a round room, walls covered entirely in mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different version of me, older, younger, thinner, bloodied, and one mirror in the center, completely empty. I stepped closer, and for the first time in days, I saw myself, but it wasn't me now. It was me, as a child, 8 years old, wearing the old pajamas my mom bought at Walmart. The boy in the mirrors didn't move with me. He stood still. Then slowly he raised a finger to his lips and made a shh gesture. Then behind the glass, I saw a shadow flash past. A hand slammed against the mirror from the inside, cracking it wide open. I screamed and stumbled back. The room began to tremble. All the mirrors started to crack, then shattered. Glass raining down like crystal rain, silent but carrying the moans of hundreds of trapped souls. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed, in my apartment. It was morning. Everything looked normal. I could even see my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I thought I had dreamed it. I laughed like a madman, nearly sobbing with relief, but then I saw something that froze my blood. A piece of paper lay on the table. Not mine. An old yellowed medical file. My name was on it. My photo. But under status, it clearly read, deceased, February 13th, 1999. I was born in 1991. That meant I died at age 8. I screamed, ripped the paper to shreds, but it didn't change the truth. I was living in something that should not exist. I sought out the only person I thought I could trust. Mrs. Raymond, the old lady on the 6th floor, who used to be a nurse. When I knocked, she looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "You're not the first." She brought me into her room, filled with old photographs and floor plans from when the building used to be a hospital. Among them was a torn document titled Project B2, Failed Soul Resurrection Experiment. B2 was never on the official maps, she said. It's not a physical flaw. It's a rift, a place where lost souls are trapped. I saw you back in 1999. You were one of the children taken there, but no one dared to speak of it. Then why am I still alive? I asked, my voice cracking. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Because your soul never left that place. The one I'm speaking to now is just a shell pretending to be human." I backed away in terror, but she handed me something. An old leather notebook with 2 embossed words on the cover, "Soul Mirror." "Want to keep living? Want to truly be human again?" she asked. "You must find every mirror that remains from B2 and destroy them. But remember, every mirror contains a soul that refuses to let go of this world. And you only have 3 days." I left Mrs. Raymond's apartment, clutching the trembling notebook. Behind me, my shadow on the floor didn't follow. It stood still. Then it turned its head and smiled. I don't know what's more terrifying, the possibility that I may have died at the age of 8, or the fact that I only have 3 days left to reclaim my soul. The leather-bound notebook Mrs. Raymond gave me felt heavy in my coat pocket. The pages inside had yellowed with age, written in a dark ink that resembled dried blood. Each page was a map of a room accompanied by a drawing of a mirror, with a description of what lay within it. There were 7 in total, each marked with a symbol, a handprint, an eye, a melting clock, and the final one, with no description, just a black circle. I started with the first mirror. It was located on level B1, in a room that once served as the electroshock therapy chamber. I went down at midnight. The hallway of B1 was long and cold as bone. The overhead lights flickered constantly. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mixed with something metallic, like rusted iron. The electroshock therapy room was at the end of the hall. The door was off its hinges but still stood, waiting. I pushed it open. Inside, the room was pitch black, except for the light coming from a large mirror at its center. It stood nearly ceiling high, its wooden frame scorched, the glass surface dull with the dust of time. I pulled out the hammer I had brought, but as I stepped closer, I froze. The mirror did not reflect the room, but another place entirely. A metal bed. A woman strapped down, her mouth gagged with a bite guard. She was sobbing silently, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her stood a doctor in a white coat, holding an electroshock machine, the wires embedded directly into her scalp. I stared at the image, and the doctor looked up at me. He smiled, then stepped out of the mirror. I backed away, panic rising. raising the hammer. He didn't rush. Each step echoed like metal striking tile. His eyes were voids, black holes leaking blood. I screamed and lunged, slamming the hammer into the mirror's surface. The sound of shattering glass roared like an explosion. The room trembled. The mirror splintered into hundreds of fragments. The doctor vanished into thin air, his scream stretching out into some other world. In the air, a faint scent of jasmine drifted by. I knew then the woman's soul had been set free. I marked the notebook. 1 mirror shattered, 6 to go. The second one was on the 3rd floor, in abandoned apartment 3B. The door was sealed with 2 rusted padlocks. I had to pry them open with a wrench and crowbar. Inside, the space was cloaked in dust. A rotting sofa, a shattered dining table, and in the corner of the living room, an oval mirror covered by a black cloth. I lifted the cloth. This time I saw a child, a little girl around 5, wearing a white dress, curly hair, standing alone in a forest. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the moon above, casting shadows on the leaf-covered ground. She looked at me, her eyes empty. Her mouth slowly opened, and soft sobs echoed from deep within the mirror. I intended to smash it like before, but this time, I was pulled in. There was no time to react. The scene around me shifted. I stood in the woods under the murky night sky, the wind whispering like distant moans. I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned. The girl stood just a few feet away. "You came," she said, her voice a whisper like wind through grass. "Why are you here?" I asked. "Because my mother left me in the mirror." She stepped closer, her small hand icy as it touched my chest. "You can help me leave, but you'll have to leave a part of yourself behind." I hesitated, then nodded. A blinding white light engulfed me, and I woke up flat on my back in the living room of apartment 3B. The mirror was gone, but I could feel a part of my memory missing. I could no longer recall the name of my best friend in elementary school. A strange blank space had opened up in my mind. I looked back at the notebook. 2 symbols were now scorched. 5 remained. I rested that night, and in my sleep, I dreamed of all the souls I'd seen in the mirrors. They stood around my bed, saying nothing, just watching me, as if waiting. I awoke to the ringing of a phone, an unknown number. I answered. A rasping voice spoke. "Don't trust Mrs. Raymond." I tried to ask who it was, but the line went dead. Who was that? And why say such a thing? I decided to return to the 6th floor, but when I arrived at Mrs. Raymond's apartment, the door was wide open. Inside, everything had been torn apart. Furniture overturned, objects strewn everywhere. And in the center of the floor, a bloody handprint dragged all the way to the end of the hallway. Mrs. Raymond was nowhere to be found, but on the table was a torn page from my notebook. It showed the final mirror, the one with no description, only a black circle. Someone had written, in trembling handwriting along the edge, "Don't go there, unless you want to become part of it." I felt something had changed, as if these mirrors weren't just gateways to free trapped souls, but traps themselves. I was no longer sure who was helping me. Mrs. Raymond, the girl in the mirror, or maybe I was already part of whatever was pulling everyone into that place. The notebook was beginning to smolder at the corners. The black circle was spreading across the other pages. Something was coming, and I was running out of time. I didn't return to my apartment. after leaving the 6th floor. Though night had fallen and the cold was biting, I wandered the streets, clutching the leather notebook that still radiated a faint warmth, as if it were breathing. All my senses felt stretched to the brink, ready to snap at the slightest noise. Ever since I shadowed the second mirror, things had started to unravel. The dreams, the lost memories, the woman who called me at midnight. And now, the strange disappearance of Mrs. Raymond. I didn't trust anyone anymore, not even myself. I stopped at a small basement bar where the smell of cigarette smoke and alcohol blurred the edges of reality. I sat in the corner of the counter and ordered a glass of whiskey, not to get drunk, but to remember. I needed to remember. I needed to know who I was. The bartender handed me the drink, but when I looked up, my heart nearly stopped. It was the girl from the forest mirror, but now she was older, about 17, her eyes still empty, her lips mouthing a whisper. No one escapes, as long as the final mirror remains. And then she vanished, dissolved into the air like dust. I jumped up and ran out of the bar. It had started to rain. I didn't know where I was going, but some part of me was leading the way. I returned to B2. Somehow the elevator still opened to that floor. I hadn't pressed the button. It simply appeared. This time, the hallway branched in a new direction. No circular room like before. No broken mirrors or flickering lights. Just a long corridor lined with identical doors, each marked with a number: 137, 138, 139. I stopped at door 142. A voice whispered my name, not echoing, not audible, but as if someone was speaking inside my head. Come in. I turned the handle. The door creaked open. Inside was an old classroom. Wooden desks lined up in rows, a blackboard faded with chalk dust. On the walls were children's drawings, houses, a sun, and a large well with hands reaching up from within. I recognized it immediately. It was my kindergarten classroom, from when I was 8. In the middle of the room, a boy sat with his back to me. I stepped closer. He turned, and I froze. It was me. Me, at 8 years old, just like in my old medical file. He didn't move, just stared, his eyes black as ink, soulless. You're me, I asked. The boy smiled, but it was lifeless. No, I'm the part you left behind. Left where? At the well, where we died. The memories crashed into me like a flood. A summer camp, getting lost in the forest, an old well, someone calling my name, and then the fall. No one ever found a body. No one remembered. Everything was erased. Why am I alive now? I asked, choking on my words. You're not alive. You were replaced. The boy pointed to the back of the room. A large mirror had appeared between 2 lockers. Somehow, without sound. Its surface was coated in dust. But as I approached, I saw nothing. No reflection, no classroom. Only a deep black void, like the bottom of a pit. I reached out to touch it. But the boy grabbed my wrist. He shook his head. If you break the final mirror, you'll lose everything. Everything that makes you you will vanish. I don't care, I said. I just want to be myself, even if it's only once. He nodded. I understand. I want that too. But if you do, they will be released. Before I could ask who they were, the classroom began to tremble. The lights flickered. The door rattled violently. From the small glass windows, dozens of faces began to appear. Distorted, ghostly, all screaming without sound. The boy the soul left behind, ran to me and shoved a shard of glass into my hand. Only use this when you're ready. When you truly are, look into it. The room collapsed. I was thrown into the hallway. Door 1242 slammed shut behind me and locked itself. I clutched the shard of mirror, heart pounding like a war drum, still too afraid to look into it. I returned to my apartment the next morning. The bathroom mirror now showed my reflection again, but warped, twisted, like something mimicking me from the other side. I opened the notebook. 4 mirrors shattered, 3 remained, but the black circle symbol was no longer confined to one page. It had begun to spread like oil in water, blurring the words. A new line appeared on the final blank page. Welcome home. That night I received a message from an unknown number. The final mirror isn't here. It's inside you. I looked at the mirror shard the boy had given me. This time, I dared to look, and I saw, not my face, but the faces of hundreds trapped inside me. Story 3. Warehouse. No one comes back. My name is Nathan Cole. 3 years ago, after being laid off from a freight company due to workforce cuts, I took a night shift security job at a distribution center on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. Simple work. The pay wasn't great, but it was stable. I just had to be on site from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., patrol the warehouse, check the locks, report anything unusual, and most importantly, monitor the security camera system. The warehouse was as big as a small stadium with 4 storage aisles, each nearly 100 meters long, and shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. When the lights went out, the place sank into pure black, save for the faint glow leaking from the security room. A thin crack of light cutting through the belly of darkness. Last week, there was a theft. 12 boxes of electronic components disappeared from aisle B. No signs of forced entry. No alarms triggered. Management asked me to review all camera footage from that night. I powered up the computer and opened the clips from the fixed position cameras. Everything was clear until the timestamp hit 2:16 a.m. Then, the static hit. The footage glitched. A crackling noise filled the speakers, like something was trying to crawl through the wiring. I squinted and adjusted the screen brightness. And that's when I saw it. A person, sneaking into aisle B. Not a shadow, not a blur or some fleeting illusion. A real person, crystal clear. He was wearing the exact same uniform I wore. The same faded denim jacket. The same gray knit beanie I always wore when the temperature dropped. A chill shot through me. The figure turned, paused, and stared directly into the camera. And he had my face. Cold sweat soaked my back. My heart pounded. My mind swirled between 2 choices. Call the police or check it out myself. I chose the latter. My flashlight shook with each step. Aisle B was deathly still. The scent of new plastic, old cardboard, and thick dust hung in the air. I walked the length of the aisle where the camera had caught me, sneaking in. Nothing seemed out of place, until I saw it. A single black leather glove, lying on the floor. No reason for it to be there. No one should have left it. I picked it up, ice cold. The leather had stiffened, like it had been soaked, then dried. I brought it closer to examine. Inside, there was writing. Tiny jagged lines written in red ink, repeating over and over. 2:16. You can't run. You can never run. I flung the glove away and ran back to the control room. The next morning, I called Jake, an old friend of mine who worked in digital forensics and data recovery. I sent him the corrupted clip. A few hours later, Jake called back. His voice was different, low, disturbed. "Are you sure you didn't tamper with this file?" "I don't even know how to do that, Jake." "Why?" "Because the video has metadata showing it was edited 3 days before the theft took place, from a device that can't be traced. And there's something else." Jake sent me a still frame he had pulled from the clip. The moment I looked into the camera. But this time, the image was clearer, brighter. His mouth was moving. Jake zoomed in. I could barely breathe when I saw the words forming on those lips. "I'm real. You're the replacement." I didn't dare sleep at the warehouse after that night. I reported it to management, but they dismissed it, claiming it was likely a system hack and promised to investigate later. I took a few days off, hoping things would settle down, but they didn't. That night, I got a call from an unknown number, a woman's voice trembling. "Is this Mr. Cole? I work at Warehouse 7. I saw you standing in aisle C. But you're not on shift tonight, are you?" I froze in my living room. She continued, choking on her words. "He's looking at me. He's not blinking. And oh God, he looks just like you." I drove straight to Warehouse 7, about 5 miles from where I worked. It was an old facility, shut down 3 years ago, after a fire that left 2 people missing. Their bodies were never found. When I arrived, the place was silent, but the steel door was open. I stepped inside. On the far wall, facing an old rusted camera, someone had written a massive message in white paint. "Each warehouse is a world. Each person is a version, and only one may remain. After 2:16. I don't remember how I got out. I just know that since that night, whenever the clock strikes 2:16 a.m., I don't look at any screen. Because I know he's still there, in the clips, in the warehouses, and he's waiting for me to make a mistake. I started keeping a journal every night, not out of habit, but as a precaution. Something was happening, and I needed proof. It was too late for anyone to believe me, just through words alone. Ever since that night at Storage Room 7, I've been haunted by a feeling that I was no longer the only me. Those words scrawled on the wall. Only one entity may exist after 2:16. Repeated in my head like a curse. I tried avoiding that time, but no matter how much I ran from it, it kept finding me. The next day, I returned to the main warehouse to collect my personal belongings. Management informed me I had been let go due to unstable mental condition. I couldn't blame them. How could I, when even I wasn't sure if I was sane anymore? I packed slowly and made my way out of the surveillance office. Then I saw something that made me stop cold. The back door of the warehouse was open. The heavy steel door that I knew was always secured with both a manual and electronic lock, now gently swung back and forth in the breeze. I walked over. No one was there. But on the wall next to the door, drawn in something dark and tar-like, someone had painted the outline of a person without a face. Right below it was a message. "I'm still here. Every time you look at the screen, I get closer." I brought the video, the one showing me, to another imaging expert in Colombia, someone with a background in digital forensics. Her name was Diane, in her 40s, calm and exceptionally logical. After several hours of analysis, Diane called me over, her hand trembling as she pointed at a slowed-down sequence of images. Look closely at your shadow in the footage. Doesn't something seem off? I squinted. Then I saw it. That shadow. It doesn't reflect on the floor. Diane nodded and stepped back, as though just realizing that fact made her deeply uneasy. And there's more. The timestamp in the footage keeps looping. It's caught in some sort of cycle. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, every night, exactly at 2:16, the footage replays the same moment, showing you walking in, performing the exact same actions. But there's always one detail that changes. I swallowed hard. What detail? She printed out 3 still frames. 3 nights in a row, same moment. In each, the version of me had a new inconsistency. One night it was a bruised hand. Another night, blood seeping from the right eye. And the last night, I froze. I had no eyes, just 2 deep, black, empty sockets. That night, I downed 3 cans of beer, but still couldn't sleep. One question kept looping in my mind. If I am repeating the same actions in the camera, where does it end? At 2:10 a.m., I couldn't resist anymore. I played the footage again, tonight's footage, something that shouldn't exist yet. But it was there. It was already playing. I saw myself, or him, entering row B again. But this time, he didn't look at the camera. He stopped between the shelves, tilted his head upward, and slowly turned to look straight at me. Not through the screen, but directly into my eyes, through the live camera feed. It wasn't old footage. It was live. I jolted back, dragging my chair across the floor. The screen went black. All the lights in my house flickered, then went out in an instant. I heard a soft thump outside the window, like someone had just jumped down from something high. I fled my home, driving like a madman to Deanne's place. She answered the door in her pajamas, eyes still heavy with sleep. But the moment she saw my face, she knew it was worse than anything I could say. I told her everything. She pursed her lips, then said, "I know someone, an old man named Luther. He used to work on AI research during the Cold War. There were rumors that he developed a surveillance system capable of capturing frequencies not of this world." I let out a shaky laugh. "You mean ghosts?" Diane looked at me straight, not a hint of hesitation. "I mean, if something is using technology to breach the limits of reality, he might know." We drove to an old wooden cabin near the Francis Marion Forest. The house looked like it belonged to another world, a place where time had stopped. Luther, now in his 80s, was still unsettlingly sharp. When we finished explaining everything, he said just one thing: "The camera chose you." I didn't understand. "There are weak points between layers of reality," he said slowly, "and when an eye, one that sees too much, lingers, it becomes a gateway." I shuddered. "You mean it opens something?" "Not something. Someone. A reflected entity, created from data, but without a soul. It will find the original and replace it." I couldn't speak. Diane had gone pale. "What do I do?" Luther looked at me, his eyes full of shadow. "Don't look into the camera anymore, not at 2:16 a.m. And never let your eyes meet its through the lens. Because if that happens, it'll know you're ready for it." But it was already too late, because tonight, when I returned home, I discovered a new video saved on my doorbell camera, the one I had installed for safety. Timestamp, 2:16 a.m. I didn't dare open it, but deep down, I already knew. Inside that video was me, or something that looked exactly like me. standing right at my door, smiling. I thought I could avoid watching the footage from the front door camera. I thought if I ignored it, if I looked past the 2:16 a.m. timestamp, like Luther warned, it would all stop. But the truth is, curiosity is more cursed than fear. I opened the file. The clip was exactly 16 seconds long. It began with the front porch of my house dimly lit, the wind tossing around dead leaves. At the 6th second, he appeared. My silhouette, or a version of me, stepped into frame. Silent, slow, same old worn-out coat, same beanie pulled low over the forehead. But this time, something was different. I can't explain it exactly. He looked just like me. Every detail, every step, even the faintest twitch of my brow. But he wasn't. Alive, no breath, no gaze, just a husk wearing my skin. At the 12th second, he looked up slowly, staring straight into the lens. His mouth moved slightly. I scrubbed back and forth, trying to read his lips. Eventually, I figured it out. One word. Tonight. I left my house immediately, carrying a backpack with a few clothes and the hard drive containing all my recorded footage. I went to Diane's place again. She opened the door with dark circles under her eyes. The table behind her cluttered with notes, diagrams, and data. "I've been researching similar cases," she said as I sat down. Since 2009, there have been at least 7 reported incidents involving doppelgangers tied to security cameras. All happened after 2 a.m. All began with a glitched recording, and all ended with the original person disappearing. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She looked at me, voice trembling. No one survives after facing their duplicate. They don't go missing. They get replaced. Family, friends. No one notices the difference. "But me?" I asked, clinging to a shred of hope. "You're breaking the pattern," Diane said slowly. "You haven't let it get close. And this, maybe you still have time." We decided to return to the warehouse one more time. This time, we brought infrared cameras, high-powered flashlights, an EMF detector, everything we could use against something not of this world. The clock read 1:43 a.m. when we arrived. The sky was pitch black, the warehouse dead silent, not a single light on. We entered through the back door, the one that had mysteriously been opened before. The moldy scent rose immediately, as if something had been sleeping here for decades and had only just woken up. We split up. Diane held the EMF device while I headed straight for the surveillance room. The monitors still glowed, showing the 4 camera angles. I checked camera B's hallway, empty. 1:56 a.m., 10 minutes left. I was about to shut the monitors off when camera 2, the one pointed at the outer loading dock, flickered. A figure passed by. I held my breath. It was him. Diane's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "You see anything?" The meter just spiked red. "Something moving around aisle C." I nodded reflexively, then cursed. She couldn't see me. I spoke into the radio. "Get out. Now, Diane. Leave." No response. 2:14 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted from the control room, sprinting through the hallways. The hum of static echoed through the wiring, the familiar sound of interference. I screamed, "Diane!" A loud crash from the end of the corridor, like something heavy falling. I turned, shining my light. In the flickering beam, I saw Diane, or something wearing her shape, walking toward me. I exhaled in relief. "Diane, it's me." She, or it, stopped, said nothing. My flashlight flickered again, and then I saw it. Her face had no eyes, just 2 deep, hollow sockets, pitch black. oozing a thick dark fluid that dripped onto the concrete floor. I screamed. I turned and ran. 2:16 a.m. Every light in the warehouse went out. I flipped on the infrared mode on my handheld camera, and on the screen, I saw them. 3. No, 4. Tall, faceless figures scattered across the aisles, all turning to face me. They began moving. No footsteps, no breath. I ran back to the surveillance room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Somehow, the camera monitors flickered back on. Despite the power outage, and on them, I saw myself. But I was standing outside the door, holding the very same camera I had in my hand. I looked down. The camera was still with me. So, what the hell was that? It was looking back at me. I don't remember how I escaped. I only remember Diane's scream tearing through the darkness. And then, silence. The police arrived an hour later, but found no one else but me. They scoured the entire warehouse. No functioning cameras. No Diane. Nothing. I was detained for 3 days, questioned, evaluated. They didn't believe me. No one did. But when they released me, there was something in my coat pocket, something I knew I hadn't brought. A key card. It had my name printed on it. Access code 216, Warehouse 9. Tonight I received an email. No sender, no subject. Just one attachment. Camera 2:16 a.m. final version .move with a single line of text. Choose, be human, or be the version. I didn't open the video file. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I knew exactly what it wanted. For me to watch. I threw the USB drive containing the footage into the back of a drawer and locked it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Diane's hollow black eyes staring at me through the crack in the door. I stayed awake, watching the clock tick minute by minute. 2:10, 2:12, 2:14, and at exactly 2:16 a.m., the tiny red indicator light on the door camera lit up, even though I had unplugged the power cord. I pulled out the hard drive, my phone, my laptop, everything that could record. The light went out. The next day, I decided to go to Warehouse 9. Not out of curiosity, but because I felt that if I didn't, sooner or later, it would come looking for me. Warehouse 9 was deep inside an abandoned industrial zone north of Columbia. No nameplate, no guards, no lights. The rusted iron gate stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone. I pushed the gate open. A gust of wind swept down the corridor, carrying the stench of rust, damp paper, and something disturbingly familiar, like sun-scorched human skin. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of dust-covered goods, the ceiling lower than usual, pressing down as if the air itself were collapsing. At the center stood a small gray brick room with a single frosted glass window and one monitor on a desk. On the screen, black background, white letters, "Welcome back." I staggered back, panicked. Back? How? I'd never been here before. I turned and bolted for the main entrance. But it was gone. In its place stood a solid concrete wall. Smooth, seamless, no signs of recent construction, no fresh cement. I was trapped. Behind me, the monitor crackled. I turned. A video was playing. Me. Or something that looked like me. Walking through the warehouse, exactly as I had minutes earlier. Each step, each glance. But when I turned to run in the video, the thing didn't follow. It stopped, looked straight into the camera. Then, it did something I hadn't done. It bent down and picked something up off the floor. I aimed my flashlight toward that spot, my hands trembling, and stepped closer. On the floor was an old yellowed photograph. Me and my mother, taken when I was a child. A photo I thought had burned in a house fire when I was 8. How was it here? I flipped it over. On the back, scribbled in crooked handwriting, "You're not the original. You never were." I collapsed. My heart thundered. A wave of vertigo hit me like a crashing tide. If I wasn't the original, then who was? A clanging noise behind me snapped me upright. I turned the light. In the dim glow, I saw a steel hatch partially embedded in the floor. No handle, but mounted on its surface was an old analog security camera, the kind used in the 90s. I stepped closer. The camera lens blinked, then powered on. And there I was, standing before it. But the me on the monitor was smiling. The thing I was watching was smiling at me. I smashed the camera, grabbing a metal rod and prying the hatch open. With a heavy grinding crack, it gave way. The stench hit me instantly. Thick, rotten, like corpses hastily buried. I descended. The stairs led into a subterranean room. Walls covered in erratic childlike drawings. The same faceless figure, repeated over and over. In the center stood a circle of old CRT monitors. Each screen showed a different moment in my life. Me, graduating high school. Me, cradling my first cat. Me, sitting in church at my mother's funeral. Me, crying alone on the night I lost my job. None of these moments ever had a camera, then a voice. Not from speakers, not from any machine, from inside my head. Nothing is private. Nothing is real. Everything is a recording. I clutched my head and screamed. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. One of the monitors went black, then flickered back on, showing me, today, sitting before that exact screen. Hands shaking, eyes hollow. That wasn't me anymore. That was the thing that had taken my place. I looked around. No one. But I felt thousands of eyes watching me from behind the walls. I couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller, closing in on me. And then, I passed out. I woke up in a hospital. They said I was found wandering along a highway over 20 miles from Warehouse 9, covered in dried blood, with no ID. I tried to explain, but the doctors looked at me the way people look at lunatics. They kept me under observation for 72 hours. I pretended to be fine, pretended to forget. Once I was released, I went straight back to Warehouse 9 looking for proof, but there was nothing there. Just an empty lot, no warehouse, no cameras, no trace of any structure ever standing there. That night when I got home, the lights in my living room switched on before I touched the switch. On the table was an old camera, placed neatly. Next to it, a slip of paper. Now it's your turn to record. Story 4. There are eyes in the walls. I moved into the apartment at the end of October, just as the first icy winds of winter began to whistle through the narrow alleys of Portland, Oregon. The unit was on the 3rd floor of an old building constructed in the 1960s. Though it had been renovated a few times, it still held the cold breath of the past. The reason I chose it was simple. The rent was unbelievably cheap, a steal for a part-time student like me. But eventually, I came to understand. Nothing that cheap comes without a price. The first day went smoothly. The apartment was small but functional. A living room, a compact kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom with frosted glass. It was quiet. The neighbors weren't particularly friendly, but they weren't a problem either. I even felt a small sense of peace. After months of struggling to afford rent, I finally had a little corner to call home. Things began to change in the second week. That night, I got home from work exhausted and decided to unwind with a hot shower. Steam fogged up the mirror, coating it in a hazy white mist. In that silence, I felt something strange. Not a noise, not a flicker of light, just a sensation, like someone was watching me. I shivered and turned around. In the bottom left corner of the tiled wall beside the tub, where the white tiles lined up perfectly, I noticed a tiny black dot. So small, it could have easily been missed. A round hole, just the size of a chopstick tip. I bent down to look. Nothing. Just a pitch black opening. I grabbed some bandage tape and sealed it up, then laughed at myself for being ridiculous. But I couldn't sleep well that night. I dreamt I was showering, and from the wall, a massive eye stared at me. Unblinking, every time I turned away, it moved, slithering between the tiles to keep watching. The next morning, I went into the bathroom as usual. The tape was still there. But then, I froze. On the opposite wall, next to the towel rack, another hole had appeared. Same size, same black void. This time, I didn't laugh. I sealed both holes, checked every inch of the wall, even used a flashlight to peer into the grout lines, trying to see if someone in the neighboring unit had tampered with the wall. But nothing seemed unusual. Everything was silent. That night I went to bed early. Around 2 a.m., I suddenly woke up to a faint sound, like breathing, very close. I lay still, frozen. The breathing was soft, steady. It wasn't coming from outside, not from the window, not the hallway. It was coming from inside the apartment. I slipped out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, and crept toward the bathroom. The lights were off, but I could feel a chill emanating from within. I opened the door. No one was there. But when I flipped the light switch, what nearly made me scream wasn't a new hole. It was the mirror. On the fogged surface there was a mark, a fresh one, clearly drawn with a fingertip. A circle with a black dot in the center, exactly like the hole I had seen before. I shuddered and wiped the mirror clean. Not a trace remained. The next day, I told Tom, a classmate of mine who knew a bit about construction. He came over that afternoon with a powerful flashlight and a thermal scanner. We inspected every wall. Tom tapped and listened closely. When we reached the bathroom, he froze. "Do you hear that?" he asked, eyes fixed on the wall beside the tub. I stayed quiet. I heard nothing. But Tom insisted. "There's something, or someone, scratching on the other side. Very softly, like fingernails." I didn't know if he was trying to scare me, but the look on his face said otherwise. He took photos of suspicious spots and said he'd send them to a friend who worked on old buildings. That night, I was alone again. The bathroom walls were now sealed tight with silicone. I even installed a fake tile layer over it to make sure nothing could get through. But as I was washing my hair, the light suddenly went out. I stood motionless under the stream of warm water. 1 second, 2, then scrape, scrape. A dragging sound across the bathroom floor. I opened my eyes in panic, water splashing down my face. In the darkness, I saw something move, a shadow, no clear shape. But I knew it was there, right beside me, watching. And I heard it again, the breathing. But this time, it was heavy, urgent, like someone holding back a violent impulse. I threw the door open and ran, slipping on the floor outside. When I turned back, the light came on. No one was there. But the bath mat outside the bathroom door had been dragged out of place, and on it was a soaking wet footprint. A footprint coming from inside the bathroom. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't leave. My lease wasn't up, and I didn't have enough money to move. The next day, Tom called me back. His voice was shaking. "Lisa," he said. My friend looked at the wall images. "There's something you need to know." I stayed silent. "The unit behind your bathroom wall has been vacant for almost 3 years. The last tenant was an amateur filmmaker. The police found him hanged in the bathroom." I went cold, Tom continued. "Before he died, he drilled multiple tiny holes throughout the unit. He'd hidden homemade cameras inside them. My blood froze in my veins. They never recovered all the cameras," he added. "Some are still unaccounted for." I dropped the phone, then slowly turned toward the bathroom. And for the first time, I realized that feeling of being watched might have never gone away, because maybe I was never really alone. Ever since Tom's call, I haven't dared to enter the bathroom alone. I even leave the light on all night. But the light doesn't make me feel safer. If anything, it makes it easier to notice the small changes. And that's when I started to see something shifting. Not the items on the shelf, but the room itself. The cracks in the tiles stretching a little longer. A tile bulging out slightly, as if pushed from the other side. A scratch on the mirror I was certain hadn't been there the day before. I was losing sleep, waking up in the middle of the night again and again. And every time I did, I heard breathing. Wet, ragged breaths coming from somewhere very close, as if right under the bed or behind the wall. One night, unable to take it anymore, I did something stupid. I grabbed my phone, turned on the camera, and scanned every corner of the bathroom, hoping to capture something that could explain the madness in my head. And then, in the far corner, beneath the sink, where the light couldn't reach, the screen showed a red dot, like the indicator light of an electronic device. I staggered back, heart dropping into my stomach. Within seconds, my mind raced through hundreds of possibilities. Hidden cameras, surveillance systems, or worse, someone behind the wall. I called Tom in the middle of the night. He arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a wireless signal detector. When he turned it on and swept across the bathroom, the needle spiked violently at one point, right where I'd seen the red light. Tom removed the wooden panel behind the sink. That's where the water pipes ran. And inside, wedged between rusted metal tubes, was a small black circular device, carefully hidden and wrapped in moisture-resistant fabric. A mini camera, wireless, still functioning. Tom removed it, his face pale. "Lisa, this isn't just about someone who's dead. Someone is still watching you. This camera wasn't installed long ago. The battery is nearly full." I sank to the floor, hands clutching my head. This apartment had become a trap, and I had no idea I was the prey. We called the police first thing the next morning. They came, searched the place thoroughly, and took the camera for investigation. An officer named Marquez, assigned to the case, said they'd be in touch if anything came up. But his tone made it clear. I was just another victim in a city riddled with perverts and stalkers. And the people behind these crimes were often very good at hiding. 2 days later, I got an anonymous email. "My eyes are everywhere. Tiles can't hide me. The more you cover, the more I see." and I love the way you shiver when you shower. I vomited the moment I read the last line. I informed the police again, and they began tracing the IP address. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. Whoever this was, they knew tech too well. That night I decided to sleep at Tom's place. But as I packed, I heard a faint click from the bathroom. The door, left slightly ajar, was slowly opening. There was no draft. No one else in the apartment. I walked toward it, hands trembling, clutching a mop as a makeshift weapon. Inside, everything looked the same. But then I saw it. A new hole, right under the edge of the sink. And this time, I didn't seal it. I bent down, quickly pressed my eye to it, just for a glance. All I saw was darkness. But just as I was about to look away, an eye suddenly opened from the other side, staring straight at me. I screamed, stumbled backward, hitting the wall with my head, everything blurred. Then went black. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Tom said he found me unconscious on the bathroom floor, a small cut on my head. But what gave me chills wasn't the injury. It was what he said next. When I got to your apartment, everything was Loctite. But the mirror in the bathroom, Lisa, it was covered in black marker. It said, "You can't stop me from watching. I'm already a part of this house." After being discharged, I never went back to that apartment. I rented a short-term place near downtown, where there were more people, bright lights all night, and noise that made me feel less alone. But leaving didn't end it. A week later, when I opened my suitcase to grab clothes, I found something strange in the side pocket. A small black USB stick. I swear I had never seen it before. Terrified and curious, I plugged it into my laptop, hoping it was empty. It wasn't. There was only one folder. Lisa Bathroom November. I opened it. Dozens of video clips appeared, footage from different angles. The bathtub, the sink, even the towel rack, and all of them were of me, showering, changing clothes, sometimes just sitting curled up on the floor. Completely unaware, I was being watched. The last clip was a nighttime recording. I was asleep. The camera was frighteningly close, like it was placed right at the edge of the bed. In the final minute of the video, a face appeared in the darkness, inches from the lens. Eyes gleaming, mouth curled into a grin. And then a whisper, "I love how you sleep when you think you're safe." I slammed the laptop shut, trembling. For the first time in my life, I understood true fear doesn't come from the supernatural. Real fear is knowing someone is watching you. Every second, every minute. And that person might be right behind you. I don't know how long I had been sitting next to the open laptop. The screen was still on, frozen on the final frame of the video. The face of the man who had been watching me, pale as a drowned corpse, his cracked lips curled into a smile of twisted delight. His eyes, they weren't human. No emotion, no life. Just two bottomless pits that swallowed everything. I closed the laptop and forced myself to breathe. My thoughts were a tangled mess. I had left the old apartment. I had reported everything to the police. I had done everything I could. And yet, he still found me. He knew where I lived, knew how to slip the USB into my luggage, which meant he had gotten close. So close, and I never even noticed. I called Officer Marquez immediately, wondering, too. Then he picked up. His voice was deep and tired, but carried the steady calm of someone long accustomed to dealing with the most vile parts of society. "I found a USB in my suitcase," I said, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. "It has footage of me, recently taken. "Where are you?" he asked. I gave him the address. Less than an hour later, 2 officers arrived, bringing signal detectors and hidden camera scanners. Marquez came with them, and this time, he no longer wore his usual calm demeanor. After watching the video, he remained silent for a long moment before saying, "He's not just watching you. He's enjoying your fear." It was the first time I saw real concern in his eyes. Eyes that had dealt with countless cases of sexual predators. This wasn't just duty. This was a warning. "He could be someone close," Marquez said. "A neighbor, a co-worker, someone who's been following you for a long time, unnoticed." They swept the room I was renting. No hidden cameras, no strange signals. But I knew he wouldn't be that easy to find. After that, they offered to move me to a temporary police-protected apartment, a small studio on the top floor of a secured building, guarded 24/7 with surveillance cameras everywhere. But even in that safe space, I couldn't sleep. The nightmares started. Every night, I saw myself standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection wasn't me. It was a distorted version, my face, but with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. And in those dreams, I always heard a whisper behind me, "I see you. Even when you don't see me." I woke up soaked in sweat, sometimes with scratches on my arms, as if I had been struggling in my sleep. Then, one Saturday morning, I got a call from Tom. His voice shook with fear. "Lisa, I think you need to come to my place now. There's something you need to see." When I arrived, he was standing at the door, pale, holding a brown envelope. "I got this in the mail this morning," he said. "No return address. Inside, there are photos." I opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of pictures. All of me, sitting in the library, waiting at the bus stop, dozing off in class. Every shot taken from up close, as if the photographer had been just a few feet away. No blurry angles, no obstructions. He was either a professional or terrifyingly familiar with stalking. The last photo stole my breath. It was me, sleeping in the bed of my new, supposedly secure apartment. How did he get in? How did he know? I felt like I was being eroded by the minute. There was no safe place left. No matter how many doors I locked, no matter how many lights I turned on, he always knew where I was, what I was doing. Marquez arrived as soon as I called. This time, he brought a cybersecurity expert named Adrian. He examined my laptop, and within 15 minutes, he found it. A spyware program running in the background. "Someone's been remotely controlling your webcam," Adrian said. "And they've been doing it pretty often." I threw up in Tom's sink. When I returned, Adrian pointed at the screen. The data shows a connection being established at night, nearly the same time every time. Each session lasted a few minutes. It looks like he just wanted to watch you while you slept. I couldn't cry anymore. Fear had passed the threshold of emotion. I felt like an exhibit in a glass cage, a walking doll living under constant surveillance, stripped of identity. Tom tried to comfort me. "I've been thinking about hiring a private investigator. Maybe we need to find him before he really acts." That night, I returned to the temporary apartment. But this time, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the bed, opened the laptop, and removed the tape over the webcam. I wanted just once to look back. And when I turned on the camera, the screen showed my face. Pale, sunken eyes. But after a few seconds, just as I was about to turn it off, I saw something change. Behind me, on the wall, a shadow passed by. I whipped around. Nothing. I turned on every light, checked every door, every drawer. Everything was locked. No one was there. But on the small bathroom mirror, a new message had appeared, written with a wet finger. I was here before you ever came. I collapsed. No one believes me anymore. He's not just a voyeur. He's the darkness that lives inside the place I once called home. He exists in the cracks, the walls, the holes. He's the eyes in the night, the breath behind the dripping sink. And now, he's starting to leave traces. I don't remember how long I sat on the cold tile floor, staring at the water-smeared message on the mirror. I was here long before you came. There was nothing left to reassure myself with. This had gone far beyond the realm of a sick voyeur. It wasn't just about someone watching anymore. It was a presence, something that never left this place, that didn't need doors or passageways, and had no reason to exist, yet did. I called Tom, but his line was busy. I thought about calling Marquez, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the window. Not cold, but carrying a sound eerily like whispering. I turned back to the mirror, wiping hard with a towel. As the fog cleared, I froze. Reflected in the glass wasn't just me. A shadow stood behind me, silent, unmoving, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for me to notice. I spun around. Nothing. Empty. I began to question myself. Was I imagining all of this? Paranoid from stress? Or worse, what if everything I was seeing was real? The next day, Adrian came back to check the apartment's electronic systems again. I hadn't slept all night, slumped in the chair, with eyes glazed over like a junkie. Adrian sat across from me, his face tense. Lisa, I picked up a strange signal coming from the bathroom wall. The frequency doesn't match any common Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. It's more like an automated recorder. I swallowed hard. You're saying there's something inside the wall? He nodded. Could be a bug, or something transmitting a signal outward. Marquez arrived shortly after. This time, he approved drilling into the wall. 2 technicians came with him, bringing thermal scanners and heavy-duty equipment. I stood by the doorway, hands clenched, barely breathing. The drill whirred, tiles cracked, and dust filled the air. Then one of the men shouted, "Oh God!" Inside the wall, where they'd just got through, wasn't just a device. It was a room, a narrow crawl space, less than a meter wide, about 2 meters tall. Just enough for someone to stand or crouch. There was no door, no entrance, but clearly someone, or something, had lived there. The walls were scratched raw, like fingernails had dug into them. Dried blood and charred writing, smeared in charcoal. "I see you. Don't cover it. I need to watch." "You're mine." In the center of the tiny room was an old wooden chair. And on the floor, dozens of videotapes, old magnetic reels covered in dust. I collapsed to the ground, ears ringing. He had lived right next to me, maybe the entire time. He never left. He just retreated into the wall. One technician shined his light deeper inside, then staggered back, pale. Behind the far wall was a body, partially decomposed, roughly wrapped in a moldy tarp. The face had rotted away, but the faded baseball cap and dented employee badge in his pocket confirmed the identity. The former tenant across from me, the amateur filmmaker who was said to have committed suicide. But clearly, he never died in his own apartment. He had lived in the walls. He had watched everything, And one day, he died in the very world he had built. But if he's been dead all this time, who's been watching me? I was sent for a psychiatric evaluation immediately after. They said I showed signs of paranoia, severe PTSD, and needed rest. But I knew everything I saw wasn't a hallucination. He, or something like him, is still there. I moved in with Tom for a while. He tried to bring normalcy back, cooking, taking me for walks, talking about anything but him. But on the third night at Tom's, I heard a rattling sound in his bathroom. It was close to 2 a.m. I left the room, heart pounding. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I didn't want to go near it, but my legs kept moving. I pressed my ear to the door. A whisper came from inside. Dry, broken, barely human. "You thought you left?" "I'm very close." I flung the door open. The light snapped on. No one was there. But on the mirror, again, a long streak of moisture. Like a hand had just touched it. Tom ran in, finding me frozen. I pointed at the mirror. "It's him again," I whispered. "He doesn't need the old apartment. He doesn't need walls. He's inside me now." Tom held me, but I knew everything had changed. What hid behind those tiny holes wasn't just a sick man. It was a mindset, a habit, an invisible eye always waiting. Once you realize you're being watched, no matter where you live, who you're with, how many times you lock your doors, you'll still see it. Through mirrors, through screens, through breathing in the night. It doesn't need to see you, because it's the thing that makes you watch yourself until you go insane. Story 5. Wearing a human face. I reunited with Andrew on a late afternoon in early October, as fog began to creep down from the mountains near Pinewood Valley, the place where he was found after being missing for 3 days during that fateful trekking trip. We grew up together in the suburbs of Northern California. Andrew wasn't just a close friend. He was the kind of person every mother in the neighborhood trusted with their children. Quiet, kind, a nature lover, and especially skilled at navigation. So when I heard he'd been lost in the forest for 3 days, I could hardly believe it. The police found Andrew on the morning of the 4th day, slumped under an ancient redwood tree. He had no serious injuries, just dehydration and signs of exhaustion. He couldn't say much, only repeating one sentence. I wasn't alone. At first, I was overjoyed at his return, but the more time I spent with Andrew, the more I felt something was off. He looked exactly like Andrew. Slightly tousled brown hair, deep hazel eyes, and his usual slightly hunched posture. But in those eyes there was something empty. That evening, I visited Andrew's house, where he had been living alone since his mother passed away last year. From the outside, it was still the same small wooden house nestled against the hill. But inside, the atmosphere was chilling, despite the fireplace burning brightly. Andrew stood with his back to me in the kitchen, and the first odd thing I noticed was that he was slicing an apple with his left hand. Andrew was right-handed. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned around, a slow smile spreading across his familiar face. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, I've been having some weird dreams." "Dreams?" "Yeah, I see. A wooden cabin. I'm trapped inside. Someone, or something, is standing outside the door." Andrew's voice dropped almost to a whisper. I clenched my hands, trying not to reveal the fear creeping through me. Do you remember anything from those 3 days? Andrew shook his head. I remember walking into a canyon, and suddenly, it went dark. I couldn't hear anything except my heartbeat. Then everything blurred, like in a fog. 2 days later, I discovered another strange thing. Andrew didn't remember the name of the dog he'd had for 7 years. Bear, his beloved golden retriever, had died 2 years ago from cancer. But when I mentioned Bear, Andrew just gave a puzzled smile and said, "It was Rex, right?" No, the real Andrew would never have gotten that wrong. I started paying closer attention. He never blinked when looking at me. He never ate meat, even though he used to be a BBQ enthusiast. And especially at midnight, I received a call from Andrew's number. But when I answered, there was only a faint whispering, like someone speaking underwater. I saved the recording. Listening closely, I could make out a male voice whispering, "Don't trust him. He's not me." I decided to share this with Clara, Andrew's ex-girlfriend. She had also just met him the day before and shared the same uneasy feeling. When he hugged me goodbye, his hands were ice cold, but Andrew always had warm hands. Remember? Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. That night, Clara and I decided to secretly place a mini camera in Andrew's living room. Not to spy, but to confirm. Was he really Andrew? Watching the footage, my heart felt like it was being squeezed. Around 2 a.m., Andrew stepped out of his bedroom, but instead of heading straight to the kitchen like every night, he stood motionless in the dark for over 10 minutes. Just standing there, staring at the wall, not moving. Then suddenly, he tilted his head back, as if looking up at the ceiling, and his mouth began to murmur in an unidentifiable language. His voice, distorted, elongated, and filled with deep resonant tones, like the sound from a broken cassette player. Clara burst into tears upon seeing that. I vomited. We took the video to an acquaintance who researches linguistics. He said it wasn't a human language. It could be some form of audio encryption or something more ancient than humanity. The next night, I received a text from Andrew's number. "You know now, don't you?" I didn't reply, but the camera showed him standing in front of my house at 3 a.m. No knocking, no movement, just standing there, like a tall, dark figure amidst the thick fog. The next morning, I left Pinewood, but the story didn't end there. A week later, the real Andrew was found in a canyon east of the valley. He was unconscious but alive. His clothes were tattered, his fingernails torn, as if he'd been desperately digging at something. When he woke up, his first words were, "That thing? It took my face." Andrew truly woke up after nearly 3 days in a deep coma. He had been placed in a special care unit at Mendocino County Hospital. I drove 5 hours straight to visit him, my head swirling with unanswered questions. He looked gaunt, hollowed out, though his eyes, those same familiar eyes, now held something else. Fear, a deep, primal kind of fear that had no name. I sat beside his hospital bed. His hands were wrapped in bandages, fingernails shattered, the flesh underneath bruised and purple, as if he'd struck stone over and over. I asked softly, "Andrew, do you remember anything?" It took him a long time to move his lips. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken, like it had been scraped raw by forest winds. "I never left the canyon. The thing you met wasn't me. That night I rented a motel room near the hospital. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fake Andrew standing silently in front of my house. unblinking, like a wax figure that breathed. The next morning, I returned to the hospital with a notebook and a small recorder. I needed the truth, and even though something deep within me screamed not to hear it, I had to ask. "Start wherever you want," I said, as Andrew stared dreamily out the window. "Begin when you entered the canyon." Andrew took a deep breath, his hands clenching the thin blanket. I split from the group to find a spot to take photos. The wind was strong, and I started hearing something like whispers, faint, as if they were echoing from far away. I thought it was just the wind through the rocks. Then I saw a crack in the cliff face, small, but just big enough to squeeze through. I swallowed and clicked on the recorder. Inside, it was freezing. The air felt frozen solid. Every step echoed like I was descending into the earth. Something was watching me. Not an animal, and not a person. A shiver ran down my spine. Andrew closed his eyes tightly, as if recalling each detail through a hazy veil. I came to a chamber. No, more like a cave. Jagged stones hung from the ceiling like claws, and in the center was a copy of myself, just standing there, smiling. I couldn't move. I was held still by its gaze. It walked toward me and spoke in my voice. "Now it's your turn to stay." I remembered the strange recording I had received. Andrew's voice whispering beneath water. Don't trust him. It made sense now. The person I had been talking to, eating with, confiding in these past few days. That wasn't Andrew. It was something wearing his face. Clara arrived at the hospital later that afternoon. She brought with her an old letter Andrew had written to her back in 2020 when they were still together. I saw Andrew's hand tremble as he opened it, as if real memories came flooding back. "I remember this," he whispered, tears silently falling. I looked at Clara. We both knew the one lying here was the real Andrew. But if that was true, where was the imposter now? The answer came sooner than expected. That night, in Pinewood, someone called the police after finding a man who looked just like Andrew, sitting motionless in the woods near Pitch Pine Lake, eyes wide open, muttering nonsense. The police brought him in. They thought he was in shock. But then, he vanished from the holding cell at midnight. No broken locks, no camera footage. All that remained was a pool of cold water on the cement floor. The next day, Clara and I returned to the canyon, bringing along a local named Elijah, a man who had lived in those woods for nearly 40 years. He brought incense, salt, and something called a soul-binding cord, a thread woven from human hair and cedar bark. The moment Elijah stepped into the crack in the rock, he turned right back around, face pale as ash. "Whatever's in there, it's an ancient form," he said. "It doesn't kill, it borrows. It survives by wearing someone's life. And if it's out now, Andrew won't be its only target." We fled the forest that very night, but the nightmare didn't end. Every person who had been part of the hiking trip with Andrew began meeting strange fates. One disappeared while fishing in Lake Tahoe. Another was found hanging inside his apartment, locked from the inside. And me? I started dreaming of the canyon. Every night, I stood before it again. The whispering returned, calling to me, drawing me step by step, closer, closer. The last time I saw Andrew was under a blood-red sunset. He sat by the stream, eyes distant. "Do you think I'm still myself?" he asked, like he no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. I didn't know what to say, because after everything that had happened, maybe a part of Andrew was still trapped in that canyon. I started to doubt myself the night I saw my own face, smiling back at me in the mirror, though my lips hadn't moved. It was 2:37 a.m. I hadn't slept in days, not since the real Andrew was found. The bathroom light was dim, casting a washed-out glow on my face. Hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes, veins like spider webs. But for a split second, that face changed. It wasn't me, not entirely. The chin was slightly sharper, the skin paler, and the eyes, God, those eyes, empty and cold, like metal soaked in ice water. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, everything looked normal again. The mirror reflected me, at least who I believed to be me. I didn't tell anyone, not because I feared being called insane, but because I was afraid someone was listening. The days that followed, I tried to act normal, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp clothes. No matter where I went, at a coffee shop, on the bus, walking down the street, I felt someone behind me. Every time I turned around, there was no one, just shadows, or people who looked too much like me. I called Clara, hoping she could help ground me back in reality, but her voice, it was strange, hollow, almost identical to the fake Andrew's voice before. "Are you doing okay?" Clara asked, but the question sounded more like a command than concern. "Clara, is that really you?" Silence. "Do you remember the trip we took to Mirror Lake last year?" I asked, clinging to a memory only the two of us would share. "What are you talking about? You mean Crystal Lake?" she replied. And that voice wasn't Clara's. Had the real Clara disappeared? Or worse, had she been replaced? I began digging into the past, tracing clues from the earliest days of Andrew's disappearance. I visited the old bookstore once owned by a woman named Marion. She was known in town as the Weirdo, someone who claimed to speak with forest spirits. Marion was now over 80. Her eyes were clouded like misted glass, but when I mentioned the ravine, she trembled and started mumbling. "They don't eat flesh. They eat time. Every time they borrow a body, they take memories, habits, even the soul. But there's always a flaw, a detail they can't mimic." I asked how to spot that flaw. She whispered, "The face. It's the last thing they learn. If you see someone whose reflection doesn't match, run." That night, I performed an experiment. I set up a camera facing the bedroom mirror, aimed at myself. I sat still for 2 hours, doing nothing but staring. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. My heart stopped when I saw the reflection blink. 2 seconds before I did. And then, at the 87th minute, the reflection smiled, while I remained perfectly still, expressionless. I threw the camera against the wall. It shattered. There was no doubt now. Something was slowly borrowing my face. I started taking notes on all the minor changes in my behavior. I found myself writing with my left hand, though I'd always been right-handed. I ate apples without peeling them, something I'd always hated. And worse, I couldn't remember my mother's birthday. I didn't know who I was anymore. I decided to visit Andrew. He was staying with his sister, temporarily in Santa Rosa. When I arrived, Andrew looked at me with suspicion and took a step back. "Are you?" "You?" he asked, almost pleading. I didn't answer. I didn't know the answer. "Look into my eyes," Andrew said. I need to know you're still you. I looked, and in that moment, I felt something, some connection, the bond of two childhood friends, but his gaze quickly filled with terror. No, you're not him anymore. I left Andrew's house immediately. Rain poured down, each drop slicing through my jacket like icy needles. I sat in the car, hands trembling. If Andrew no longer recognized me, then who was I? That night I locked myself in the room. Lights off, curtains drawn tight. I took a razor blade and made a small cut on my finger. To feel, to make sure my blood was still red, still warm. But the cut didn't bleed. The skin didn't break. I can't tell anyone this. They won't believe me. Or worse, they've already been replaced too. I'm writing this not as a cry for help, but as a record. If one day you read this, Andrew, please kill me if I'm no longer me, because I'm no longer sure. Since the moment I stepped into that ravine with you, if I ever truly came back out, I began to see people without shadows, not in a hazy or semi-visible way, but truly non-existent. They crossed the street at dawn when the light slanted in from the east, yet the pavement behind them remained smooth and empty. No elongated shadow, no form cast down. An old lady in a dark purple cardigan stepped out of the pharmacy and passed right by me. I watched her go. My shadow stretched long behind me, angled with the morning sun. Hers? Nothing. I rushed over to the window of a parked pickup truck, using it like a mirror. I saw myself, but not her. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. Every time I looked into a mirror, I couldn't be sure that what looked back was truly me. There were moments when I turned my head, and the reflection lagged half a second behind. Once, I stood completely still, but the mirror showed my fingers twitching. I started covering every mirror in the house, took down glass-framed pictures, even removed the face of my wristwatch, since metal reflected light. But somehow, they still saw me. I left Pinewood, moved to a small southern town, renting a room in an old ground-level house. No cameras, no TVs, no mirrors. I bought canned food, ate with my hands, drank from plastic bottles, and avoided seeing my face on any surface. I slept on the floor, back to the wall, always keeping a knife in my pocket. But then, they still found me. The first knock came around 3:23 a.m. 3 knocks, not loud, not soft, just enough to chill your bones. I held my breath. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, not faster, not slower. As if the thing behind the door had waited centuries before, and could wait centuries more. I didn't open, but when I peeked through the curtain slit, I saw myself standing outside, wearing a black hoodie, faded jeans, same posture. Except for one thing, it had no face, no nose, no mouth, no eyes, just a smooth layer of pale skin, like a stretched rubber mask. And it nodded. I haven't slept another full night since. I called Andrew. His voice rasped over the phone. I've seen them too, he said. They don't just steal faces. They steal memories. I'm starting to forget how to spell my name. I look at old photos and don't recognize anyone. And worst of all, I'm not sure if I'm still Andrew. We arranged to meet one last time at a small cafe deep within Sierra National Forest, where reclusive old folks lived. People who sensed spirits more than they saw them. Andrew had lost weight, deep eyes, tangled hair. But somehow I knew this was still my friend. We didn't shake hands or hug. We just looked at each other and understood. I don't think there was just one crack, Andrew said. There were many, and what lived inside, it escaped long ago, They're not in a hurry. They replace people, one at a time. Slowly, this world might not belong to humans anymore. An old man approached our table, blind, walking stick in hand. He spoke softly, with a thick southern accent. I heard you boys talking about the ones without reflections. I saw one, in my mirror back in 1967. It smiled, even though I was crying for my mother's death. He sat down, exhaled. They can mimic everything, except real feeling. If one day you hug someone you love and feel nothing at all, leave immediately. We parted in silence. Andrew went north. I went south. On the train out of Sierra, I saw a group of schoolchildren at the far end of the car. They laughed and chatted happily. But one of them cast no shadow. Light streamed through the windows. Every child had a shadow but that one. It looked at me and smiled. A smile that looked exactly like mine. I've decided to write everything down. Not to warn, not to fight them, but so that if one day I'm replaced, someone will read this and understand. The real fear isn't being killed. It's being forgotten. Who am I? I don't know anymore. But if you ever meet someone who looks like me, talks like me, smiles like me, ask them, when was the last time you saw your shadow? If they can't answer, run. Story 6. My mother is no longer my mother. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or demons. Rational, grounded, a little skeptical. That's what I inherited from my mother. But maybe the woman living in my house now is no longer my mother. And if that's true, then everything I've believed in up until now is collapsing. I'm Evelyn, 27 years old, a night shift nurse at a nursing home on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. My mother, Lillian, 62, is a retired high school teacher, once sharp, strict, and always a little grumpy. She suffered a minor stroke in early February and was in a coma for 3 days before waking up in the ICU at Saint Anthony State Hospital. The doctors called it a miracle. I called it the first strange thing. I was the first person she saw when she woke up. She said my name. Her voice was the same, but the way she looked at me, no, those eyes, they were cold, empty, almost devoid of emotion. They weren't the eyes I'd known for the past 27 years. They weren't my mother's. 3 days later, I brought her home. She walked slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't need a cane. Everything seemed artificially normal. She remembered my name, remembered the baked pasta I hated since I was a kid, remembered Fluffy the cat who died when I was in middle school. But in every story, every action, there was something missing. Like she was repeating someone else's memories instead of recalling her own life. That night, while I was wiping down the kitchen table, I heard a creaking sound, like the closet door opening in her bedroom. I figured she was looking for her nightgown, but when I passed by her room, I stopped. She was whispering to someone, very softly, a voice that sounded like a snake slithering across old wooden floors. I strained to hear. Don't let her know. It's not time yet. Wait a little longer. I thought I misheard. I knocked on the door. Mom? Who are you talking to? She went silent. A moment later, her voice answered, flat and steady. Just muttering to myself, old people do that. But there wasn't the slightest hint of surprise in her voice. No hesitation. It was too perfect, like a rehearsed line. For the next 3 nights, I left my bedroom door slightly open and listened for the tiniest sounds in the house. At exactly 2:37 a.m., always that time, I heard whispers from her closet. This time I was sure there were two voices, hers and another, deeper, raspier, not like anyone I'd ever known. I told my best friend Ellie. She works at the city library and loves anything supernatural. Ellie told me to record it, so I did. The next night, I slipped my phone into the pocket of her nightgown while helping her get dressed. The next morning, I played the recording. The first 10 minutes was silent, but at minute 11, her bones are soft, like the last girl. Remember? Be careful. Evelyn's getting suspicious. She's not like the others. I dropped the phone. My hand turned ice cold. They were talking about me. And that voice, it wasn't human. That night, I came home earlier than usual. Around 2 a.m., without turning on the lights, I crept into the house. I heard the floorboards creaking from her room. I tiptoed closer. I cracked the door open. She was standing, facing the closet, arms hanging limp. The closet door was wide open. Inside, I saw a tall, thin shadow standing at the edge. It had no face, just a dense black form, like it was absorbing all the light. She murmured, "She's not ready. Don't ruin it." I slipped away before they noticed me. The next morning, I took her for a full checkup. The doctor said everything was fine. She was alert, her memory intact. No signs of delusion or neural damage. She smiled at me. But those eyes, I'll never forget. The eyes without a soul. That night, I cleaned out my father's old room. He died in an accident 6 years ago. While dusting the bookshelf, I knocked over an old picture frame. Behind the photo was a hidden letter. The handwriting was my dad's. The letter was dated August 14th, 4 days before he died. It said, "Lillian's not right lately. Every night she whispers in the closet. I saw something, but it wasn't human. If anything happens to me, don't let Evelyn stay too close to her." I collapsed to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest. So Dad had seen it too. This didn't just start after her coma. I started piecing the signs together. The soulless eyes, the midnight whispers, Dad's letter, the inhuman voice. And one more thing, something I'd never been sure about. The night before she was hospitalized, I remember her standing in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, lips moving, but no sound coming out. When I asked, she said she was checking for wrinkles. But in the mirror, I saw her eyes never blinked for more than 4 minutes. I need help, but I don't know from who. And the scariest part is, even knowing all this, I still have to live under the same roof with the woman, or whatever it is, that wears my mother's face. Every night at 2:37 a.m., her closet creaks open again. And I know something is waiting for me to step inside. I didn't sleep that night. My father's letter cut deep into my subconscious, dragging up scattered memories I had long abandoned. Turns out, I had suspected her long ago. I was just too afraid to name the feeling. I sat alone in Dad's study until nearly dawn, under the faint glow of his desk lamp. The image of my mother, or whatever shadow that wore her face, lingered in my mind. Those lifeless eyes, the whispering voice. And now, my father's final warning. I had to find out what was really happening. The next morning, I took 3 days off from work, saying it was to care for my mother. My manager hesitated before approving, her voice softer than usual when she said, "Evelyn, you've looked tired lately." If you ever need to talk, I'm here. I nodded, knowing she could sense the tension boiling under my skin. But how could I explain? No one would believe me. When I got home, my mother was knitting in the living room. The TV was set to a news channel, but muted. She looked up at me, smiling. But no one smiles with just their eyes like that. Blank, hollow, like a talking glass doll. You took the day off? Yes, I wanted to stay home. Good, stay home with me. A simple phrase, but something in her tone made my skin crawl. That afternoon, while she napped on the sofa, I crept quietly into her bedroom. Everything was unnaturally tidy. The kind of order you find in showroom displays. Not a speck of dust, not a trace of everyday life. I started with her bedside table. The first drawer held some vitamins and an old Bible. The second contained a hairbrush, lotion, and a few old receipts. I opened the third drawer. At first, I thought I was looking at a thick black cloth. But as I lifted it, I found a stack of hand-drawn papers, warped images scratched with heavy, frenzied pencil lines. Some gouged so deeply they tore the page. The first drawing showed a faceless head crawling out of a slightly open wardrobe, mouth agape and full of jagged teeth. The second, a woman torn in half, blood swirling into a spiral. Scribbled in the margin. Must keep them in the closet. Must lock them away. Don't let them out. I swallowed hard and turned to the next page. There was a drawing of me, sleeping. On my forehead was a strange symbol, an eye dripping blood. Next to it, the word, chosen. I didn't remember my mother ever knowing how to draw. I dropped to the floor, heart pounding like a war drum. These sketches, they weren't the work of a sound mind. And they had been hidden well. I shoved them all into the pocket of my coat, preparing to leave when I heard the faintest footsteps behind me. I spun around. No one. But the closet door was slightly ajar, and I was sure I hadn't touched it. That night, I went to Ellie's house. She greeted me with a tight hug. I showed her the drawings. Ellie bit her lip. Evelyn, this symbol, I think I've seen it somewhere. She pulled a research notebook from her bookshelf, filled with entries on ancient magical symbols. After nearly half an hour of searching, she pointed to a yellowed page. The symbol matched the eye of the second reality, a sign believed to represent entities from beyond our reality, beings that could possess humans whose souls had slipped from the primary flow. You mean, my mother isn't really my mother? I don't know, but if this is true, it's not just her. I think you're being watched too. That night I didn't dare return home, but at 3 a.m. I received a text message. No number, no name, just one sentence. You're doing it wrong, Evelyn. Come home. I trembled. Was it her? It? Or someone else entirely who knew what I was doing? The next morning, I hid a mini camera in my mother's room, tucked inside an old stuffed bear on her bookshelf. I set it to record automatically from 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. That evening, I stayed home. I curled up in my room, eyes fixed on the ceiling, too afraid to blink. At 3:12 a.m., I heard the creak of a closet door, then footsteps, at first to one pair, then more. It sounded like 3, maybe 4 people walking barefoot down the hallway. I clutched the small knife hidden under my pillow, holding my breath. Then, my bedroom door creaked open, but no one stepped in. I waited. 10 minutes, 20, nothing more. The next morning, I checked the footage immediately. The camera recorded my mother sitting up at 2:38. She walked to the wardrobe, opened it, then knelt. A bony hand emerged from inside, gripping her face, pulling it close, as if whispering something directly into her ear. She nodded. Then she turned and stared straight at the camera, right at the spot where the teddy bear sat. I have never seen a smile so twisted, so cold. I knew then. I didn't have much time left. Whatever was living inside my mother, it now knew I was investigating, and if I didn't act soon, I'd be the next one in the closet. I started to sense something strange in the air. Not the usual chill from changing seasons or the shivers from sleepless nights. It was something damp and haunting, as if every molecule around me had been soaked in something that didn't belong to this world. Since the night I found that video recording, I hadn't been able to sleep deeply. Every sound startled me awake, and worst of all, I started seeing things that weren't there. I saw the shadow of a man standing at the end of the hallway every time I turned on the light. I saw the bathroom mirror fog up, even when there was no steam. I saw my mother's eyes shift color in an instant, from deep brown to a pitch black that reflected no light. I knew I was sliding into a darkness, and if I didn't hold on to my sanity, I might never come back. It was Ellie who suggested the abandoned house. She had found a note tucked inside an old book mentioning Red Hollow Psychiatric Center, a facility that was shut down after a string of unexplained deaths. The center was about a 40-minute drive from Flagstaff, and strangely enough, the address matched a place where my mother once taught before she moved in with my father. Coincidence? Or another link in the chaotic chain slowly becoming clear? I left early Saturday morning. Ellie offered to come along, but I wanted to face this alone. Something in me whispered that if anyone else got involved too deeply, they'd become the next target. Red Hollow was no longer a center, just a crumbling block of concrete nestled deep within a forest of old pine trees. Cracked walls, loose bricks, and every window boarded shut with rotting wood. I climbed in through a busted back door. Inside, it was pitch black. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the moldy scent of decay. And something else. A sharp, metallic tang, like rotting flesh, mixed with chalk dust falling from the ceiling. Story 7. The Memory of a Death no one believed was real. I always remember my sister, a memory that refuses to fade, even though I was forced to forget. Her name was Rachel. She was 4 years older than me, with shoulder-length chestnut hair usually tied to one side with a purple ribbon. I still remember how she tied the ribbon into a butterfly shape, then beam when I told her it looked pretty those summer afternoons at the old house on Springfield Hill. We used to play hide and seek in the backyard, our laughter echoing beneath the maple trees like fragments of a memory that refused to die. Rachel died when I was 8, a horrific car accident on a freezing rainy night. The car spun out, flipped several times before plunging into a rocky ditch behind the hill. I remember the police lights flashing across the ceiling, my mother's screams, and the numb chill like the breath of death pressing against my skin. And yet, no one believed me. No one believed I ever had a sister named Rachel. "You're imagining things," my mother said gently, though her voice felt unfamiliar. "You're an only child. You always have been." I screamed. I pointed to the old photographs I knew had Rachel in them. I recited every detail of her room, even described the handmade ragdoll she once sewed for me. But when we searched, the photos now showed only me, or eerie empty spaces. Her room had vanished as if it never existed. And the doll? Gone. I searched for hours. Not long after, we moved into a new house in suburban Ohio. Mom said a change of scenery would help stabilize things. But I knew the truth. There was something about the old house they didn't want to talk about. The new house sat at the end of a quiet street. An old 2-story wooden structure. Clean, but aged. I didn't mind it much. Except for one thing. The antique mirror at the end of the upstairs hallway. It always made me feel uneasy. Its surface was covered in a thin layer of dust, as though no one had ever cleaned it, despite Mom swearing she had. The oak frame was ornate, carved with intricate patterns, with a long crack down the right side like a dry scar. I saw Rachel for the first time in that mirror one autumn night when I was 12. I had gotten up to get water and noticed the hallway seemed longer than usual. Each step echoed strangely, repeating itself, out of sync with my body's movement. Then I glanced at the mirror, and my heart stopped. She was there, clear as day, inside the mirror, eyes wide open, her face pale and waxy, the purple ribbon crooked, wrinkled. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. I spun around. No one was there. The hallway was empty. But when I looked back into the mirror, she was still there. I ran to my room, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried not to cry out loud. From that night on, she appeared whenever I was alone. Always in the mirror. Always with bleeding eyes, and her lips silently moving. I started keeping a journal hidden under my pillow. October 14th. She appeared again at 3:17 a.m. Her eyes looked sunken. Her hands seemed to reach toward me, like she wanted to pull me in. I even sketched her posture, the bruises on her wrists, and a dark red stain below her skirt. I couldn't tell if it was blood or shadow. I told Mom, but this time, she got unusually angry. Don't ever bring that up again. There is no Rachel, do you understand? There never was. She slammed my door shut. I heard her sobbing on the other side. So I began to investigate. I searched hospital records, the town library, and finally, my grandmother. She was the only one whose face shifted oddly whenever I mentioned Rachel. One day, while driving me home from school, she sighed and gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. There are things people choose to forget in order to keep living. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, dear. I tried to ask more, but she changed the subject. That night, Rachel appeared again. But this time, words appeared on the foggy mirror. "Why didn't you save me?" I screamed. The mirror didn't shatter, but the lights went out. The power flickered through the night. Mom said it was just a normal malfunction. But the electrician said the wires on the second floor had been cut, snipped piece by piece. I haven't slept well since. Every night, whispers brush against my ears, like someone murmuring right at my neck. Don't let them erase me again. And then one day, I discovered something that chilled me to my bones. In the basement storage, buried beneath the dusty old boxes, I found a small wooden box with Rachel faintly etched into the lid. Inside were a purple ribbon, a half-burned rag doll, and a photograph of two girls standing in front of the maple trees. Me and Rachel. Only Someone had scratched Rachel's face out with a red pen. I brought the photo to my mom. She froze, eyes wide, then screamed as if I had uncovered something forbidden. She snatched the picture, tore it up, and threw the pieces into the fire. "Don't bring that up again. We've already paid the price." I stood there stunned. Did she just say, paid the price? Paid for what? That was the moment I knew. They hadn't forgotten Rachel. They had chosen to erase her. And I was the only one who still remembered. But the more I remembered, the closer I got to another reality. Because Rachel wasn't just a memory. She's still here. And she's angry. I didn't sleep that night. The wind howled through the cracks in the window like someone crying, accompanied by the steady scratching sound coming from the end of the hallway where the mirror stood. I tried covering my ears with a pillow, wrapped myself tightly in the blanket, but nothing could drown it out. That sound clung to my consciousness like sharp claws gently raking across my skin. And then a faint laugh echoed, cold, shattered, just like how Rachel used to laugh. I bolted upright, whether from fear or some strange compulsion. I got out of bed, opened my door, and tiptoed into the hallway. The dim glow from the nightlight at the far end illuminated only one thing: the mirror. I walked toward it, my heart pounding like a war drum. Each step felt like sinking deeper into a nightmare with no way out. When I was about a meter away, I stopped. The mirror didn't reflect me. It reflected another hallway, a darker, decaying version of the one I stood in. Peeling walls, a damp floor, and at the end, a wide-open room bathed in a dim red glow, as if lit by the fires of hell. And in the center of the mirror was Rachel, but not the Rachel I once knew. Her hair hung long and dripping wet, like she'd just walked through a storm. Her skin was pale, blotched with bruises. Her eyes were now two hollow voids, ink black and endless. She no longer stood. She crawled, limbs contorted awkwardly, as if her joints were broken. Her fingernails screeching as they scraped along the floor from inside the mirror. I turned and ran full speed back to my room, slammed the door shut, and shoved the dresser in front of it on reflex. That night, I heard a gentle knock on my door. 3 times. Then silence. The next morning, I wandered through school like a sleepwalker. People chatted and laughed around me, but I couldn't focus. The image from the mirror haunted me. I was eating lunch alone when a classmate named Jamie approached. We had never been close, so I was surprised when she sat beside me with a strange expression. "Are you okay?" Jamie asked softly. I nodded, avoiding eye contact, trying to hide my unease. Jamie leaned down, pulled a small notebook from her backpack, and slid it toward me. "I just noticed you keep a journal. I used to do the same, but I stopped after I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." I opened the notebook, and my stomach tightened. Inside were red ink sketches, mirrors, a long-haired girl, shadowy rooms, and a scrawled message. "She's in the mirror, but she doesn't want to stay there." Jamie looked at me, her eyes glassy. "I used to live in the house your family moved into. That mirror, it used to belong to my aunt. She disappeared mysteriously. The police never found her body. After that, people in the house started getting haunted." "Haunted how?" I whispered. Jamie shook her head. "I don't remember much. Just that I once saw a girl in the mirror. And after that, I had sleep paralysis almost every night. I heard someone whispering in my ear. And once, I woke up with long scratch marks on my back. My parents sold the house right after that. My hands went cold. Pieces of memory, things my mother had hidden, they were forming a fractured picture. That night, I did something a part of me knew was insane. I placed a small camera facing the mirror, turned on night mode, and locked myself in my room. Trying to sleep, 3:17 a.m. The familiar sound woke me. I bolted up, grabbed the camera, and reviewed the footage. At first, nothing. But exactly at 3:17, the mirror warped. It no longer reflected the hallway. It showed a dark room, and from the center of the mirror, a pale hand slowly reached out, nails long, caked with dried blood. Then Rachel's face appeared. Her eyes stared directly into the lens. Her lips moved. I rewound the footage, trying to read her lips. They switched me. They hid my body. I shuddered. Who were they? Where was she hidden? The next morning, I went to see Grandma. This time, I didn't ask. I demanded the truth. She stared at me for a long while, then sighed and pulled a yellowed envelope from a drawer. You weren't supposed to know this, but maybe it's already too late. Inside was a copy of a death certificate. Name, Rachel Marlowe, my sister. Date of death, June 4th, 2011. Cause, traumatic brain injury from car accident. I stared at her, my eyes burning. I told you, why did everyone say she never existed? Grandma bit her lip. Because your mother was involved in a ritual, a kind of curse removal. I don't know the details, but there was a woman, someone who called herself the Mirror Keeper. She said that to save you from a fated death, a soul had to be switched with someone close. My spine turned to ice. They traded places to save me, and Rachel had been trapped in the mirror ever since. That night, I stood before the mirror, holding a purple ribbon I found in the box. I'm sorry, Rachel, I whispered. And for the first time, Rachel moved differently. No longer crawling, no longer twitching. She stood, her eyes welled with tears. Then she raised her hand, pressed it to the inside of the mirror. I reached out, touched the glass. Ice cold, but I could feel something alive. Suddenly the lights flickered. The house trembled faintly. The mirror cracked. A long fissure ran down the center. I stepped back. The mirror shook. Then came the whispers, echoing throughout the house. Trade. Open. Release. After that night, I was no longer myself. Some mornings, I woke up with dried blood crusted at the corners of my lips. Some nights, I dreamed of wading through a thick, black, foul-smelling liquid, where Rachel's hand reached out from within the mirror, drowning in despair. The whispers never stopped echoing in my head, like wind whistling through a cracked window. Give her back. Give her back. I started talking to myself. No, more accurately, I was answering someone. Jamie was the first to notice the change. One afternoon after school, she pulled me behind the basketball court, where no one went, her voice low and tight. You have to stop looking into mirrors, not even for a second. I looked up at her, and she instantly stepped back. Her hand trembled as she lightly touched my cheek. Oh my God, your eyes, your pupils just dilated and shrank rapidly, like they're trying to hold on to an image inside. I didn't respond, because I knew what Jamie couldn't bring herself to say. Rachel was looking through my eyes. I went home and opened the old box that held the last remnants of my sister. A purple ribbon, a scorched doll, a crumpled scrap of old paper, torn from a larger notebook. I smoothed it out. Written in shaky black ink were the words, "Find the mirror keeper. Don't trust her. Don't let her touch the mirror." My heart pounded. Who was her? And why had Rachel written this? I remembered what Grandma once said. A woman, one who calls herself the mirror keeper. She was real, and I had to find her. I found the address in an old notebook Grandma had left on the table. On the last page, scrawled in the corner, MK 322 Helmsworth Road, Thornwood. A small town, nearly a 2-hour drive from home. I didn't tell my mom. I just texted Jamie. If I'm not back by midnight, go to Thornwood. House 332. I got there at 5 p.m. The sky was overcast, gray and heavy, like it might collapse at any moment. The house was tucked deep within the forest, hidden behind dense birch trees. The black wooden roof sagged under age, and the moss-covered walls were strangled by tangled ivy. I knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open on its own with a long, drawn-out groan. Inside was pitch black. Only the faint glow of scattered candles lit the hallway. The smell of rotting wood and something stronger, like decaying meat, hit me so hard I staggered. A woman's voice called from deep inside the house. "You've come, child of Rachel." I froze. How do you... No one can carry the scent of one imprisoned in glass unless they've seen her, and let her see them. I stepped in. The woman was sitting on a rotting stool, surrounded by hundreds of broken mirror shards embedded in the walls. She wore a long black dress, her face covered by a veil. But I could see her eyes, milky white, clouded like fog. "You want the truth?" she asked. I nodded, gripping the scrap of paper Rachel had left behind. Rachel didn't die naturally. Her soul was placed into the mirror in exchange for your life. Your mother made the choice. An ancient rite called soul exchange by reflection. All it takes is one agreement, one touch through the glass, and the stronger soul remains while the weaker one is trapped in the reflection realm. Forever? I trembled. You mean my mother agreed to that? The woman gave a faint, bitter laugh. No one is forced. They're just never warned about the true cost. I collapsed to my knees. Images of my mother holding me the night Rachel died, her grief-stricken face. Was it genuine sorrow, or the aftermath of a decision? I have to save her. I have to pull her out, I whispered. The woman stood and ran her hand gently across the fractured mirror wall. To pull one soul out, another must take its place. There must be a trade. I backed away. No, there has to be another way. She turned to face me, lifting the veil from her face. She had no skin, just jagged cracks like burned glass, raw flesh beneath, warped and exposed. Like something that had reflected wrongly for far too long in a mirror that didn't belong to this world. I am the keeper. I was once a mother, a sister, a daughter, until I chose wrong. I ran, didn't look back. On the way home, I called Jamie. No answer. I sped toward my house, heart pounding like a war drum. The house was dark. The mirror in the hallway was gone. I screamed for my mother. No reply. I ran to her room. Empty. My room. The door was ajar. Inside, the mirror. No longer in the hallway. Now, it was in my room. And in the reflection, Rachel was no longer standing there. My mother was. Eyes glowing red. One hand raised, holding the purple ribbon. stained with blood. Story 8. The Blood Ritual Wall. I moved in with my great-grandmother the summer I turned 17. A reluctant decision after my mother died in a car accident and my father vanished without a word. Her name was Eleanor. She lived alone in an old wooden house on the outskirts of Maine. Near forest, the locals called Silent Pines. They said it used to be the ritual grounds of some ancient cult. But people only talked about that when they were drunk. No one really believed it. I wasn't so sure. The house smelled of rotting wood and ointment, had no internet, no cell reception, and every door groaned when opened, as if protesting anyone who dared to pass through. But none of that was what chilled me to the bone. It was the basement door. It sat right next to the kitchen, low, narrow, and locked with a rusted padlock the size of my fist. Every night, I heard something from down there. Not rats, not dripping water, but whispers like someone murmuring. My great-grandmother forbade me from going near it. That place is not for you, she said, eyes never leaving the teacup she stirred. At first, I thought she was just old and overly cautious. But on the third night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to strange sounds. I crept down the hall, following the noise, and froze. She was standing by the basement door, a razor in her hand, slicing a deep line across her palm. Blood dripped onto the floor as she whispered words I couldn't understand. They weren't English. I caught fragments. Sarane, Elorna, but none made sense. I hid behind the kitchen cabinet, heart pounding in my chest, watching as she stepped down into the basement. The lock had opened without a key. She disappeared into the darkness. I didn't dare follow. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. I began watching her every morning. She did the same thing, cutting a hand, going down into the basement, staying for about 10 minutes. When I asked about her wound, she just gave a faint smile. You worry too much. A week later, while she napped, I snuck over and tried the padlock. To my shock, it wasn't locked at all. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the rotting wooden steps. The air reeked of mold, metal, and something decaying. I held my breath. The basement was empty, except for one wall at the far end. A red brick wall, newer than the rest of the basement. It was covered in dozens of strange symbols, drawn in something dark, almost black. They twisted like snakes, interwoven with eye-like patterns. At the center was a large circle, thick with lines and surrounded by dried blood. I shivered when I realized the blood was still fresh. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, and then I heard it again. The whispers, but this time, they were right next to my ear. I spun around. No one. I bolted out of the basement, heart thundering like it would explode. That night, I started having nightmares. Shadowy figures crawling out from the walls. A faceless woman whispering my name. A boy sobbing as his head was pressed into the blood-drawn circle. Each time I woke up, I found scratches on my hands, or tiny smears of blood at the edge of my bed. I told Eleanor. She wasn't surprised. She simply asked, "You've seen it, haven't you?" I said nothing. She sighed. I don't have much time left. That wall, it holds the oath of our bloodline. If it doesn't receive blood every day, it gets hungry. And when it's hungry, it finds someone else. I asked who it was, but she didn't answer. She just stared out toward the forest, her eyes cloudy. as if she was watching something from long ago. One morning, I woke up earlier than she did. For the first time, I witnessed the ritual from start to finish. But this time, her blood wasn't red. As the first drops hit the wall, they turned black, like ink, like boiling oil, and the symbols began to hiss. The wall shuddered. I swear it moved, as if something inside was waking up. Eleanor stood trembling. "It's coming. You have to leave." I screamed. "I don't understand. What is it?" She looked at me, and for the first time, her eyes were filled with fear. You're the next one to feed it." I stumbled back. The house began to tremble. On the basement wall, the symbol started bleeding black. And the whispers. They weren't whispers anymore. They were screaming my name. I don't remember how I got out of the basement. All I know is that when I came to, I was curled up on the porch. Morning had broken, and great-grandmother was standing on the steps, her eyes gazing into the distance, her hand crudely bandaged. I wanted to ask. I wanted to scream 100 questions into her face, but my throat was parched, and my heart still thrashed wildly from the memories of the night before. "I won't offer blood. I'm not part of this," I said, my voice trembling. She didn't argue, didn't scold. She only said one thing, words I would never forget. "No one chooses that. The wall chooses." That morning, I went upstairs to find the old family photo album. I needed to understand why, in my entire life, I had never heard of any curse or ritual. My mother had never mentioned it. Great-grandmother hadn't spoken of it. Until I found out on my own. The dusty album was hidden deep in the second drawer of her room, behind stacks of embroidered linen. I flipped through the pages and saw my mother in her youth, curly hair, somber eyes. One photo showed her standing next to great-grandmother, holding a pot of roses. Beneath it, faded ink red. The day after the first ritual. I turned the page. One had been torn halfway through, leaving only the upper half of a photograph. A hand was holding a blood-stained razor blade. I jumped at the sound of footsteps. Great-grandmother had appeared behind me without a sound. "You shouldn't dig too deep," she said, and took the album from my hands. "Your mother once tried to walk away from the ritual, but blood from this bloodline, it can't outrun the wall." Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. "Just like your mother, you've already been named." That night, I made the decision to run. I packed a few clothes, hid my phone under the living room couch cushions to throw her off, and slipped out the back path just before 1 a.m. But not even 10 minutes after crossing the edge of the forest, a strange chill wrapped around my skin. Nothing like wind. It felt like someone was breathing heavily down the back of my neck. I turned around. No one. I picked up my pace. With every step on the dry leaves, I heard another set of footsteps behind me. Slower, heavier, like something was dragging its feet. I began to run. When I reached a small gas station a few miles away, I collapsed inside, breathless, begging the night attendant for help. A man in his 50s with deep-set eyes and a southern drawl. I told him to call the police, that something was following me. But when he looked past me toward the pitch-black road, his face went pale. "You came from that old cabin by Silent Pines, didn't you?" I nodded, hands still trembling. "Couple years ago, someone just like you, a boy, showed up here in the middle of the night, screaming in terror, then vanished. Next morning, they found him lying dead in the clearing by the stone wall. Blood, completely drained." I froze. What wall? He shook his head. No one knows exactly where it is, but around here, folks call it the blood-hungry wall. He pressed a small silver pendant into my hand, a symbol of an 8-pointed star with an eye in the center. Take this. It won't help much, but it might slow them down. I didn't know who they were, and I was too afraid to ask. When I returned home, the front door was wide open. The lights were off. The house was as dark as a tomb, even though it was past 5 a.m. Great-grandmother? I called. No answer. I clenched the pendant tightly and stepped inside. The air smelled like a rusted metal and burnt ash. From the basement came a faint glow and soft, childish laughter. I moved closer, descending the wooden stairs. Each step creaked like a warning. At the bottom, I saw her, great-grandmother, standing before the wall. But this time, she wasn't offering blood. She was chanting something under her breath. And the wall, God help me, the wall was swelling. The blood-red sigils writhed like earthworms, and the central circle widened, like an eye slowly opening. Then I heard a voice, not hers, not mine, a deep layered voice echoing from within the wall itself. The air is ready. Great-grandmother turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Forgive me, Ellie, but if you don't take my place, it will kill us all. I didn't have time to respond. From the wall, a pitch-black hand with long, twisted fingers burst forth. It grabbed her by the shoulder and dragged her into the wall. Her scream echoed through the basement. Then silence. No blood, no trace. Only her wool shawl left lying on the cold floor. I stumbled back, still clutching the silver pendant. The voice returned. The next will not escape. I was there, right in front of the wall, when great-grandmother was taken. Not dead, not vanished, but consumed. That moment seared itself into my spine. Those blackened hands, the writhing symbols on the wall, her eyes wide with pain, yet filled with acceptance. And then she was gone. I stood frozen, heart pounding so violently it felt like it would split my chest. My legs trembled too much to move. The wall had gone still again, but I knew it wasn't asleep. It was waiting for me. That same night, I locked the basement door. For the first time in my life, I was the one locking it from the outside. I stacked a chair and a bookshelf in front of it, as if that could keep something from breaking through. I didn't sleep. I curled up in great-grandmother's room, shadows cast by the nightlight, twisting familiar shapes into grotesque forms on the wall. Her shawl still smelled faintly of old lavender. I clutched it to my chest, not for comfort, but for grief. The next morning, I went to the town library. I needed truth, not from great-grandmother anymore. She was gone, but from what remained of the past. The library stood beside an old church, its brick walls covered in moss and ivy. In the historical archive section, I found a decaying record titled The Marlowe Lineage and the Ancient Blood Offering. I had never heard anyone claim we were from the Marlowe family, but the name had flickered in some of the ancestral charts my mother used to hide away. I turned to the first page. The heirs of the Marlowe bloodline are bound to guard the gate between the world of man and ancient spirits. The offering is blood. If a direct descendant is not sacrificed at dawn, the beings on the other side will awaken. The page was yellowed, almost crumbling in my hands, but the words rooted me in place. Blood rituals weren't just ceremonies. They were seals. There was a handwritten addition in red ink. If the heir refuses, the wall will choose. If there's no one left to choose, the wall will open. That night, I dreamed of great-grandmother. She stood in the forest of silent pines, her skin pale, her eyes rimmed with blood. She said nothing, just raised one hand, pointing behind me. I turned and saw a crumbling stone house, a wall just like the one in the basement, but larger, more cracked, and oozing black blood from between the bricks like a stream. The blood carried with it the screams of hundreds of trapped souls. I woke up soaked in sweat and tears. The silver necklace had snapped, lying limp by the edge of the bed. I returned to the gas station where I'd first met the old man, the only one who ever believed me. But when I asked about him, a new clerk said the place had been abandoned for over a year. I didn't believe it. I met him. I spoke with him. He gave me that necklace. The smell of his tobacco-stained coat still lingered in my mind. I asked around. Locals just shook their heads. That place? Burned down a year ago. Someone died inside. They never found the body. I almost gave up. But then, in a dusty old bookstore, I ran into a strange woman. She introduced herself as Vivian Black, a researcher of the occult and European blood magic lineages. I told her my story. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply asked, "Have you seen the symbols on the wall change?" I nodded. "They move. Some nights they glow red hot." Vivian handed me a torn leather notebook. Inside was a sketch, the handprint symbol of the blood wall, exactly like the one in our basement. "This isn't the first time," she said. "It's appeared in Romania, in Scotland, in Mexico. Each place had a bloodline guarding it, and every time a guardian was killed or vanished, at least one town was erased." I swallowed hard. "Is there a way to seal it again?" Vivian fell silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "Only two ways. One, inherit the ritual. Two, kill the thing behind the wall before it has enough blood to step through." I clenched my fists. I had no intention of inheriting anything. But kill it? I returned to great-grandmother's house at dusk. The entire home was bathed in the dying orange light of sunset. In the basement, the door was still barricaded. But this time, I heard it louder than ever. The screaming. No more whispers. No more murmurs. Just a voice calling directly into my mind. "Ellie, come. Open it." I descended the stairs, this time carrying candles, salt, and a silver dagger Vivian had given me. The wall shuddered. The symbols bled. In the center circle, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. It was another version of me. Eyes black, skin pale, holding the dagger, but stabbing herself. I turned away, dizzy. When I opened my eyes again, there was another door in the wall. Not real, but forming within the cracks. I circled myself with salt, lit the final candle, and placed the silver dagger in the center of the ring. The wall screamed. A pale, clawed hand slowly emerged. I grabbed the dagger. My heart thundered. The door was opening. The symbols burned bright as fire. The wall shrieked, and I plunged the blade into the circle where the eye had opened. The wall exploded like thunder. Blood sprayed, smoking on contact. The basement shook violently like an earthquake. A scream, raw and guttural, rose, echoing and then fading into silence. When I opened my eyes, the wall was cracked. The symbols had burned to ash, and in the center, the circle was gone. Only a twisted, shriveled arm remained, crumbling into dust. I blacked out. When I came to, it was morning. I was lying on the cold floor, silver dagger still in hand, dried blood around my wrist. I climbed out of the basement. The house was eerily silent. No wind, no voices, but I knew the end was not truly the end, because on my hand, where the first drop of blood had once fallen, a faint red symbol had formed, a circle with 8 sharp slashes around it, and it was still bleeding. Story 9. I am my own killer. My name is Marcus Graves, 35 years old, living alone in a 3rd-floor apartment in an old complex in North Carolina. I'm a freelance software engineer, which means I sleep during the day, stay up all night, and can go an entire week without speaking to anyone except the delivery guy. My apartment is ordinary. Nothing strange, except for one thing. The ash-gray leather armchair by the window. That's where I work, eat, and pass out whenever exhaustion wins. The problem started on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks ago. I had been up for 2 straight days trying to finish a deadline. When the laptop screen began to blur, I closed it and told myself I'd just rest for a bit in the chair. Just a bit. But when I woke up, there was a thin, straight cut on my left arm, like a razor had glided across it. The blood had dried into a dark, flaky crust. I couldn't remember when I got hurt, but what chilled me to the core was the dream I had before waking. I dreamt of myself, but not quite me. It was my face, but the eyes were pitch black, bottomless voids, the lips pressed into a cold, emotionless line. In the dream, he stood before me, holding a small knife, the blade gleaming like ice. I was tied to the chair, unable to move. He walked toward me, slowly, and sliced right at the bend of my arm. Blood spilled. I screamed. Then I woke up. I told myself it was just a mix of sleep deprivation and stress. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I dreamt I was running through the halls of an abandoned hospital. My footsteps echoed against the cold tile. A figure chased me from behind. The same twisted version of me. He cornered me, and in that moment, he stabbed me in the gut. I jolted awake, breath knocked out of me. When I lifted my shirt, there was a deep purple bruise on my stomach. Circular, like the mark from a punch or something heavy and blunt. That's when I started to panic. I tore the place apart looking for anything to monitor myself during sleep. I bought a small camera, mounted it on the bookshelf across from the chair, set it to night mode. I went to sleep afraid. But exhaustion pulled me under, fast. That night, I dreamed I woke up. In the same room, red light flickered dimly. On my computer screen was a video feed of me, sleeping, as if someone was watching through the camera. I turned my head. He was there again. Me, with a warped grin, holding scissors. Before I could react, he stabbed my palm. Morning came. I reviewed the camera footage. Nothing unusual. Just me turning over a few times. But then I looked at my hand and froze. A thin red slice ran along the top of my right hand. Swollen, tender, exactly where the dream had shown. I went to the hospital. The doctor said I might be sleepwalking and injuring myself. They recommended a psychologist, but I'm not a sleepwalker. I live alone. No mental health history. No reason to hurt myself. I became terrified of sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, nightmares waited. And every morning, a new mark. A cut on my back. A scratch running from my neck to my chest. A bruise on my heel so deep, I limped for days. Once, I tried changing sleeping spots, moved to the bed, locked the door. But the camera showed something different. In the middle of the night, I got up, walked to the armchair, sat down, eyes closed, head tilted back. At the end of the footage, the ceiling light began to flicker, then went out. In the dim grain of night vision, the camera caught something that made me shake. I was still sitting there, but behind me, something else. A blurred, faint figure, slowly stepping forward from the hallway. I sent the video to my best friend Rick, a behavioral psychologist based in Seattle. He doesn't believe in the supernatural, but after watching it, he only said one thing: "You need to get out of that apartment." But I couldn't. It's the only place I can afford. And besides, if I'm the one haunting myself, then where would I even run to? So I tried an experiment. I asked another friend, Lily, to stay over for one night. She slept in the bed. I stayed in the chair. I told her to keep an eye on me. At dawn, she screamed. I jolted awake. But for the first time, I hadn't dreamt anything. Still, when I looked down at my chest, there was a handprint. Large, red, like someone had gripped me hard. Lily swore she had woken up in the middle of the night to strange noises and saw me, standing beside her bed, facing the window. But I was still asleep, in the chair, several feet away. She left the next morning, and I realized this isn't just sleepwalking, not just dreams. Something is living inside me, a part of me, split off or breaking free. It doesn't need me to be awake to exist. It's becoming me, and it's trying to kill me. Rick returned to North Carolina 3 days after the last phone call. The moment he stepped into the apartment, he grabbed the cloth draped over the chair and threw it back over the armchair, as if covering a corpse waiting to be buried. "You're still sleeping here?" Rick asked, voice tense. I only nodded. My eyes were sunken from sleepless nights, my shoulders trembling inside an oversized sweater. Rick looked around the apartment. His gaze landed on the dried, blotchy bloodstains smeared across the chair and wooden floor. "Marcus, are you sure you didn't do this to yourself?" "And what about Lily?" I smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "She saw me standing by the bed." "You think she imagined that?" Rick didn't answer. He simply set his suitcase down and pulled out 2 devices, a small EMF reader and an audio recorder with a high-sensitivity mic. "Tonight I'm staying here with you," he said, "but we're doing it my way." We prepped the apartment like we were walking into a professional ghost hunt. Rick placed audio recorders in all 4 corners of the room, set up motion sensors around the armchair, and positioned an infrared camera in the hallway. He told me to sleep like usual. He'd monitor everything from the next room. At 2:37 a.m., I dozed off in the chair. And then, the dream came again. I was standing in my own room, but everything was reversed. The walls bled from the cracks, dark and pulsing. The ceiling light swung back and forth, creaking. And in the center of the room, sitting in the armchair, was me, smiling, holding a shard of broken glass to his throat. I slit deep. Blood spurted out like a geyser. I screamed and ran toward him, but my legs wouldn't move. The floor clung to my feet like glue. Then, in that frozen moment, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were voids, black, soulless, but alive. "This time, Marcus, you won't wake up," I screamed, and woke up. Rick burst out from the other room, pale-faced. "Marcus, did you see anything?" he shouted, pointing at the monitor. We replayed the footage. 2:41 a.m., my body began convulsing in the chair, eyes still shut, but my limbs trembled violently. My arms rose as if grasping for something invisible. Suddenly, a handprint, large, not mine, appeared on the back of my shirt, pinning me down into the chair. My body was forced back for 10 seconds, then jerked upright like I was being strangled. At the same time, the audio recorder picked up a strange voice, raspy, like wind through broken glass. "This is my house." After that night, Rick no longer had doubts. He said we needed to investigate the apartment's history, find out who lived here before me, and what had happened. 3 days later, Rick returned with a bundle of old documents borrowed from the city library. "Marcus?" He hesitated. "That chair. It used to belong to a man named Howard Kessler. He lived here around 1983. A war veteran, diagnosed with severe PTSD. One day, police broke in and found his body. He'd been dead for 3 days. Blood everywhere, from his wrists and throat. On the armchair. Exactly like you described in your dream." My heart seized. "There's more," Rick said, handing me a yellowed newspaper clipping. Before he died, Howard wrote in his journal, "I see myself killing me every night." They chalked it up to mental illness. But what if it wasn't him killing himself, but something else? That night, I called Lily. She was hesitant at first, but eventually admitted that she'd gone online to look for answers. She'd found an underground forum dedicated to the paranormal. One post from 2 years ago was titled, "I keep seeing someone who looks exactly like me sitting in the armchair every night." The user, named JD, said he'd rented an apartment in this very building. Every time he dozed off in the chair, he dreamed of killing himself, slitting his throat, stabbing his stomach, drowning. Eventually, the injuries started appearing in real life. He left after waking up one night with a knife wound in his abdomen, barely surviving. Rick and I traced JD back to his real name, Jeremy Douglas. He now lived in a psychiatric recovery center in Chapel Hill. We visited under the pretense of academic research. Jeremy was gaunt, hollow-eyed. But when we said the word armchair, he shuddered. "I know," he whispered. "It never leaves, even if I ran." Rick asked, "What do you think lives in it?" Jeremy whispered, "It's what's left of us. The dark half. When we sleep, it wakes up, and it hates going back to the dark, so it wants to replace us." We left the facility in silence. Rick suggested one last option: burn the chair. That night, we dragged it to the back courtyard of the apartment complex, doused it in gasoline, and set it ablaze. The flames roared, red hot like a furnace from hell. But the moment the fire touched the fabric, a scream burst out. Not from the fire, from something human. A gut-wrenching, soul-splitting scream that echoed from the earth itself. I collapsed, and in my mind, a flash, me, engulfed in fire, staring at me through the flames, eyes blackened to ash, a lipless grin. I thought it was over. But that night, as I lay in bed, finally sleeping for the first time in days, I saw him again. In the mirror, no armchair, no dream, just me and me. I thought I was safe after burning the armchair, after everything Jeremy revealed, after that inhuman scream that rose from the fire. I believed, or at least tried to believe, that it was over, but I was wrong. The silence lasted exactly 3 nights, and on the 4th night, while brushing my teeth, I unconsciously glanced at the bathroom mirror and saw me, standing right behind me, close enough to breathe on my neck. But when I turned around, there was no one there. My heart clenched. I turned back to the mirror. Everything looked normal again. Just me, messy hair, sunken eyes. But I wasn't sure anymore. I started losing time. There were moments I'd wake up in the hallway of my apartment building, barefoot, still in pajamas, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. One morning, I found the fridge wide open, breadcrumbs scattered across the kitchen floor, a knife stabbed deep into the countertop, and blood on my hands, not mine. Rick still called every day, but I didn't tell him everything. I was afraid. If I did, he would know. I began to feel watched constantly, not the vague kind of watching, but something real, close, familiar, like a shadow of myself trailing just half a step behind, mimicking my thoughts, my movements, waiting for the exact moment to take over. One night, I tried something I'd read in Rick's old notes on permanent doppelganger syndrome, a rare dissociative condition in which patients believe a copy of themselves exists alongside them and is threatening their identity. I set up 3 mirrors facing one another, forming a triangle of infinite reflection. I sat in the center, turned on a dim light, just enough to see the chain of reflections stretch into nothingness. I stared at the front mirror, watching the endless versions of myself fading into the distance. But then, somewhere around the 6th or 7th layer, one of the me's didn't blink in sync. He blinked slower, then tilted his head, just slightly, but enough to raise goosebumps all over my body. I jumped to my feet. One of the mirrors crashed to the floor, shattering. But when I bent down to clean up the shards, I saw my face grinning in each broken piece. Even though I wasn't smiling, I started keeping a journal, recording every detail, every memory I could still trust. I wrote down, afraid I'd eventually lose the ability to tell real from false. Day 14. I dreamed I was strangling Rick. Blood poured from his nose. His eyes rolled back. When I woke up, I called him. Thankfully, he was okay. But his voice was hoarse. He said his neck felt bruised, like someone had grabbed it in his sleep. I said nothing. Day 15. A note from Lily. Marcus, you texted me at 3:07 a.m. last night. Asked if I still remembered you. I replied, but then you sent a voice message. It didn't sound like you. It was whispery, half English, half something else. It scared me. Day 16. I found dried blood on the windowsill, footprints in the dirt outside. Too large to be mine. Only the left foot, dragged. I started doubting myself. Every night, I stared into the mirror before sleeping. I locked my bedroom door, wedged a chair under the handle. But every morning, the chair had shifted. The lock scratched, as if someone had clawed at it during the night. I saw a neurologist, told them part of the story. They gave me sleeping pills, but they didn't put me to sleep. They trapped me awake in my own body. Sleep paralysis. And in that state, I saw him, sitting on my chest, face inches from mine, murmuring in a voiceless whisper, "It's time to give it back." I remembered Jeremy's warning. It never leaves, even if I ran. So burning the chair wasn't enough. This thing wasn't bound to objects. It was bound to experience, to the memories that unfolded on that chair. It was a presence nurtured by the dark corners of the mind. And now, after our connection had grown too deep, it wasn't just near me anymore. It was part of me. Rick suggested I leave the city for a while. Go somewhere with people, light, motion. Don't be alone anymore. I agreed, but deep down I knew, wherever I went, it would come with me. Because now, I carried him inside. I moved in with my aunt in Kentucky, a quiet little town, full of sunlight and peace. People were kind here. My aunt, Evelyn, was a spiritualist. The moment she saw me, she said, "You have the eyes of someone being watched, but not by someone else. By yourself." Her words chilled me. I told her everything. For the first time, I told it all. From the first dream to the mirror, to the paralysis. She didn't flinch. She led me to the basement. Inside an old wooden cabinet was a thick, dark, leather-bound book. A record of infected reflection souls. A folk phenomenon from the 18th century. People too isolated, too disconnected from the world, often formed a second spiritual entity. A mirror soul. It began as hallucinations, then sleepwalking. Finally, replacement. If you want to be free of it, Aunt Evelyn said, you must face it directly. Step into the place where that soul hides, call it out, and defeat it. I didn't understand. She pointed to the book. An old ritual. The mirror rite of reflection banishment. It had to be performed on a moonless night, alone, in a sealed room, with only a mirror, a candle, and your full name written in blood. I agreed to try. That night I followed the instructions exactly. Locked the door, turned off all the lights, lit the candle. I wrote my name, Marcus Elijah Graves, by slicing my fingertip and letting the blood drip onto paper. I sat in front of the mirror, stared deep into my own eyes, said my name 3 times. Marcus Elijah Graves. Marcus Elijah Graves. Marcus Elijah Graves. Nothing until the mirror began to hum. Not like water, but like something alive and caged, growling. It grew foggy, then cleared, revealing another room. Not mine, my old room. The North Carolina apartment, but now ruined, covered in blood, dead flies, and me, sitting in the armchair, the chair I burned. He looked up at me. He didn't want to replace me anymore. He wanted to pull me in, to take my place. When the image of the armchair appeared in the mirror, the very same chair I had burned to ashes, I felt a cold jolt run down my spine, like an icy hand had just pressed against the back of my neck. He, me, was still sitting there, arm draped casually over the chair, face identical to mine. But the eyes were different. They were deep, hollow, ink-black pits, like forgotten graves. He smiled, and when he reached his hand out toward me through the glass, it felt like the world around me tilted sideways. No time to think, no time to feel fear. I reached out and touched the mirror. A biting cold wrapped around my fingertips, and I was pulled inside. I don't know how long I was falling. It felt like sliding down an endless corridor where every image shattered and slipped into the void. Then, suddenly, I hit the ground. Flat on my back, I opened my eyes in a warped version of my old apartment in North Carolina. The air was thick with the scent of rusted metal. Ceiling lights flickered erratically, casting sickly pulses of light like something out of a negative film reel. Everything looked stretched, twisted, as if gravity had lost its grip. It was the room from my nightmares. Only now, it felt horrifyingly real. Then I saw him, standing right in front of me, just one step away. "I've been waiting for you," he said. My voice, but distorted, like it was bubbling up from underwater. I stepped back instinctively. He sneered, voice rough. "You burned the chair. Thought that was the end?" "What are you?" I asked, throat dry. "Some part of me?" He glided forward, feet not quite touching the floor. "I'm what you left behind. Every time you stared into the mirror and asked yourself, Who am I? That was me. I'm what no one sees. The anger, the fear, the thoughts you never dare speak. He pointed at my chest. And now, I'm stronger. I turned and ran. The apartment twisted with every step. Hallways stretched like mazes. Doors led to places I hadn't entered. Once, I opened the bathroom door and found myself staring into a hospital room. Jeremy sat on the bed, vacant eyes. "Marcus," he called, voice weak. "You ended up here too?" I stepped forward, but he, my dark double, blocked the doorway. "There's no way back, Marcus," he said. "Unless you choose, me or you. Only one of us walks out." I ran again. At the end of the hall was a mirror room. 4 walls of glass, reflecting hundreds of versions of me. But none of them moved like I did. Each me in the mirror acted differently. One laughed, one cried, one held a knife and stabbed himself in the throat, blood spraying across the glass. I stumbled backward, but when I turned, there was no way out. He stood in the mirror, my shadow self, and this time, he stepped through. We fought, not with fists, but with thoughts. Every time I tried to pull away, he surged forward, flooding my mind with twisted memories. The nights I considered ending my life, the shame I buried since adolescence, my mother's screams the night I nearly overdosed, my ex's disgust when I stayed unemployed for 3 months. He roared, "You're weak. You've always been the part that should have been thrown away. I'm the one who can survive this world." I shot up, screaming back. "Then why do you exist? Just to torture me, kill my friends, sit in that damn chair for the rest of my life?" He paused, just for a second, and I remembered what Aunt Evelyn said. "You must enter where the soul hides. You must call it out, and you must win." So I sat down, in the middle of the room, closed my eyes. He shrieked, smashed walls, charged, but I stayed still. Breathed in, breathed out, and said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the basement floor at Aunt Evelyn's house. The mirror before me had cracked, 3 long fractures across its surface. The candlelight had gone out. I didn't know how long I had been gone. Minutes, hours, days? My hands were still stained with blood. But this time, there were no new wounds. No figure in the mirror. Just me. Only me. Alone. I moved in with Aunt Evelyn. Rick visited a week later. He didn't ask much. Just sat beside me, drank tea, and said nothing. Lily messaged, "You haven't sent me any weird voice notes lately. I hope. That means you're okay." I didn't reply, but I smiled. Every night I still look in the mirror before I sleep, still afraid. But now, I let myself look deeper. I no longer see him, but sometimes, just sometimes, in the misted reflection, I see someone standing behind me. And I don't know if it's him or me.